Alrighty, now, as Nib mentioned, we have been talking about the Reinhard Gehlen organization and just who this individual is. Let me briefly sum up who Gehlen was and what his role in history is, and review very quickly a couple of the items that were on the first two Radio Free America broadcasts. First of all, General Reinhard Gehlen, last name spelled G-E-H-L-E-N, was Hitler's chief of intelligence for the Eastern Front during World War II, that is to say, the warfare against Soviet Russia during World War II. Now, Gehlen's organization, Hitler's Eastern Front Intelligence Organization, was known as Foreign Armies East, or Fremde Heere Ost in the original German. Now, at the end of the Second World War, Reinhard Gehlen and his entire Eastern Front Intelligence Organization jumped to the Central Intelligence Agency and basically became the CIA's Department of Russian and Eastern European Affairs. Gehlen had stashed all of his files on the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and 3 months after VE Day in Europe, Gehlen jumped, basically Gehlen was flown into the United States in the uniform of a 4-star general. And as I said, then Gehlen, along with his entire organization, which was complete and intact at the end of World War II, were grafted onto the fledgling CIA, formed in 1947, although they worked for U.S. intelligence between 45 and 47, and they became, for all intents and purposes, the CIA's Department of Russian and Eastern European Affairs. Now, this is Hitler's Eastern Front Intelligence Organization, complete and intact from World War II. The Gehlen organization then became, for all intents and purposes, the NATO intelligence organization, supplied NATO with the vast bulk of its intelligence during the immediate post-war period and for quite some time thereafter. And when West Germany became a nation, when the Federal Republic of Germany was incorporated in 1956, Gehlen jumped once again from the CIA to West Germany, and the Gehlen organization became the West German Intelligence Service, West Germany's CIA, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, or the BND. It's a very, very, very important thing to keep in mind that all of America's intelligence for more than a decade after the end of World War II came exclusively through Hitler's Eastern Front Intelligence Organization, and even for a long time after that, the CIA and other intelligence organizations in this country continued to depend very heavily upon the Gehlen organization for its intelligence. Now, during the first two Radio Free America broadcasts, looking back from 1984, the hidden history of the Cold War, we covered two important aspects of the Gehlen organization in the early post-war history. First of all, as the Nazis retreated on the Eastern Front during World War II, they set up guerrilla groups to basically harass the Red Army in its rear. Now, these guerrilla groups were set up almost exclusively by Reinhard Gehlen, and he worked very closely with a man named Otto Skorzeny, setting up the werewolf guerrilla group that we talked about. And these guerrilla groups carried on a fierce guerrilla warfare in Eastern Europe until as late as 1952, primarily in Poland, the Ukraine, and the Baltic states. Now, Gehlen not only set up these guerrilla groups, but he continued to supply weapons and liaison officers to these groups for, basically, while in the employ of the CIA, so that what you had was a continuum of warfare running from the Third Reich to the CIA, with Gehlen having set up these groups and continuing in contact with them and to ship them weapons and liaison officers while in the CIA, so that basically all they did was to change uniforms. Now, one of the organizations that was set up initially using some of these guerrillas set up by Reinhard Gehlen during the Third Reich and whose sponsorship was assumed by the CIA, one of the organizations which used some of these guerrillas and which was set up initially to work alongside of these guerrillas was the Green Beret, now known as the Special Forces. And Gehlen was in charge by a CIA official named Frank Wisner with setting up the Green Beret, and the three people he put in charge of this organization were three SS Nazi war criminals, basically a fellow named Professor Michael Achmeteli, A-C-H-M-E-T-E-L-I, a man named Franz Alfred Six, last name S-I-X, and a man named Emil Augsburg, last name A-U-G-S-B-U-R-G. All three worked on Hitler's final solution, that is to say, administering the Nazi extermination of European Jewry, and they then went to work for Gehlen in forming the Green Berets. And if you have any questions about that, to ask us about that during the question and answer period that we're going to have at the end of this broadcast, or you can contact us after the show, and we do have a means of getting Radio Free America tapes to people, not using the mails, but if you want to give us a call, we can tell you where you'd like to go, and that is the Gehlen Organization in brief.
All right, now the first segment that we're going to read to you is from a book by Carl Oglesby entitled The Yankee and Cowboy War. Now this book, the copy that we have, appeared in paperback from Berkeley Medallion Books, copyright 1976. Mr. Oglesby is a researcher who is formerly involved with all different kinds of things, including, among other things, student politics, and made some local appearances, and a fairly well-known individual, and now does quite a bit of research. Once again, the book, The Yankee and Cowboy War. What Oglesby is concentrating on here, and what I think is, in a way, the sort of the subtext of the broadcast tonight, is the continuity of policy, because most of us are raised to look at things historically as World War II being a period of intense dislocation, and then everything almost starting from scratch in 1945, and of course we hear all about, the Yalta conferences and things of that nature, to lead us to believe that the world was completely remade. Well, what Oglesby is focusing on, and the reason I'm going into this such depth, I hope what you folks out there listening will focus on, is that in fact a lot of the structures never disappeared. They went complete from post-World War I right through World War II, and merely just changed costumes or changed masks and went right on, and that is in fact what we're talking about here. Once again, Carl Oglesby's The Yankee and Cowboy War, and speaking specifically of the Gehlen Organization. Mr. Oglesby writes as follows: "Look what power the victors conceded the vanquished. Exclusive purveyor of intelligence on the Soviet Union and East Europe to the United States, West Germany, and NATO, Gehlen and the spirit kept alive in him and his staff had more power over official American perceptions in the post-war world than even a German victory could have given them. The Gehlen-Vlasov intelligence system had become a main source and fountain of official American consciousness. Behold the span of this concatenation. First, in the time of Trotsky, there is General Vlasov and his anti-Bolshevist army inspiring. The Vlasov apparatus is then, at a certain later point, assimilated to the Gehlen apparatus. Then, just as the White Russian spies jumped to the Nazis when their own army went down, so now the German Nazi and Russian Tsarist spies together jumped to the American army as the Wehrmacht was falling. Vlasov first became a department of Gehlen, then Gehlen became a department of Allen Dulles. This is how it came to pass that a Tsarist spy ring inside a Nazi spy ring took up the inner seats in the American foreign intelligence apparatus at the precise moment that this apparatus was starting to come forward as a major player in the great policy wars of Washington and the world. This is how it came to pass that everything official Washington would know about the Soviet Union and East Europe on most believable report, everything about the enemy our policymakers would most confidently believe, would come by way of Tsarists and Nazis installed at the center of our national intelligence system. That was a buzzard that would come home to roost again and again."
Now, one of the things in that passage by Oglesby that is very important to remember about the Gehlen Organization was that Gehlen, both, actually in all of his various incarnations, when he was working for the Third Reich, when he was working for the CIA, and up continuous through his work for West Germany with the BND, made liberal use, very heavy use, of revanchist Eastern Europeans, that is to say white Russians, anti-Bolshevik Russians, and Eastern European reactionaries of various stripes who sought to overthrow or overturn the communist and socialist governments that were set up by the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe after the end of World War II. The Tsarists and Eastern European faction of the Gehlen Organization is very, very important, notably an organization called the Solidarists, who we'll tell you more about in our upcoming program about the Guns of November. They figured prominently in the assassination of President Kennedy. One of Oglesby's phrases there, behold the span of this concatenation, might well be applied to the Gehlen Organization as he did, and I'm going to read you now a biography of an SD man who went to work for the Gehlen Organization, and this will give you an idea of the span of Gehlen's operation, both in terms of breadth and time and the massive influence that that organization has had upon the history of the Cold War. Now, the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, was the SS intelligence service, the intelligence service of Hitler's infamous and bloodthirsty elite guard, the SS. Okay, now, this article comes from a magazine called Gung Ho. That's a mercenary trade publication similar in scope and function to Soldier of Fortune. And this is from Gung Ho's issue of May of 1982. The article is called The CIA's Man for All Nations. It was authored by a man named William Seymour, S-E-Y-M-O-U-R, and the SD man in question here is a man named Helmut Streicher, last name S-T-R-E-I-C-H-E-R. And at the end of this article, Seymour gives a biography of Streicher. First of all, cover names: Rolf Meyer, Hans Moloff, Karl Rolf, William Rhein, Kark Schmidt, and others. Born Danzig, 1918, now the city in Poland known as Gdansk. Graduated from the University of Bonn, 1937. Military schools, 1937. Blut-Ordensburg, Citadel of the Order of Blood, which was the educational headquarters of the Nazi regime at Vogelsang Castle. Sonthofen, for intermediate studies and basic training. SS Junkerschule, an SS officer candidate school south of Munich in the Bavarian Alps. Active duty, 1938, in Spain as an advisor and observer. Set up spy networks and contact drops used later in the war. Was wounded slightly in combat. 1939 to 40. In the United States with cover as a German journalist. Learned English and American customs as well. Also learned spy system and worked as a courier. 1940 to 41. In Germany for additional intelligence schooling and internal work. On duty in Eastern Europe as well. 1942. On the Russian front as a combat line officer. 1943 to 1945. In Europe, Africa, in and out of many nations, both neutral and involved in the war. Some contacts with Allied agents. Worked with Schellenberg, Skorzeny, Canaris, and others. Schellenberg was for a while head of the Sicherheitsdienst, SS intelligence. Wilhelm Canaris was the head of the Abwehr, regular German military intelligence. Otto Skorzeny was an SS man we're going to tell you all about in a little while. 1945. Surrendered to British near Kitzingen on the 7th of May, 1945, escaping the Russians. Cleared by Allied intelligence. He was formally accepted into work for U.S. Army intelligence in October of 1945. 1946-47. In Europe, working for Central Intelligence Group, the forerunner to the CIA. 1948-50. In Europe, Africa, and Middle East for CIA. Had assignments in Greece and Israel. Keep in mind here that the Gehlen organization is part of the CIA at this point. 1951-57. Assigned as co-op agent to General Reinhard Gehlen, chief of West Germany's Federal Intelligence Service, Bundesnachrichtendienst. Various assignments in Europe, including behind the Iron Curtain. 1958. In United States, assigned to training with U.S. Army to serve as an intelligence officer. Working with CIA solely at the time. 1958-61. In U.S. as intelligence officer with U.S. Army. Various duties including Cuban invasion. That is the Bay of Pigs, of course. Still with CIA at this time. 1961-65. In Africa and Middle East on CIA field assignments. 1966-67. In Europe, realigning CIA and Allied co-op intelligence networks. 1968-70. In Africa and Middle East, senior field agent with intelligence gathering and observation for CIA. Posed as mercenary, writer, and tourist. 1971-73. Working in headquarter area, Langley, with training and plans assignments. 1974-77. In Africa and Middle East, intelligence gathering and inspection tours as supervisor. 1978. Retired, unquote, as of the 1st of July, 1978. 1979-1980. Contract agent on special assignment for CIA. 1980. Voluntary total retirement as of 15th of June, 1980. And One of the things that this biography here of Helmut Stryker points out, and one of the most important things to keep in mind about the Gehlen organization, is that it not only functioned as our intelligence wing, and a Nazi intelligence wing at that, after the end of the Second World War, but perhaps most importantly, it paved the way for thousands of SS and Gestapo men to move up in our own intelligence system, where many of them remain as senior officers to this day, and we're going to tell you about one of those senior officers later in the broadcast.
Now, I think actually the Stryker list, the Stryker resume, if you'll have it that way, almost is best serves as a metaphor for the entire experience of the American intelligence community and the Nazi intelligence community. You have somebody who starts out basically going through the SS rituals in the the Ordensburg and places like that, and the blood rituals and all this stuff, and eventually winding up at Langley, Virginia, training American intelligence agents. I mean, it is a very fine metaphor for exactly where, as Oglesby might have put it, where we might have gone wrong, where we might have gone a bit off the track.
These buzzards came home to roost over and over again, as he points out. Now, you'll find, particularly looking through that resume, as Nick put it, of Helmut Stryker, all of the different bases he touches in terms of intelligence, all of the different U.S. intelligence operations that he was involved in. He was involved with the Bay of Pigs, he was involved with the operations in the Congo, training the U.S. Army, and really touched just about all of the major, with the exception of Southeast Asia, which I didn't see in there, although he was training the Army. They were just about all of the major theaters of operations that the U.S. has been involved with since the end of World War II.
It's very interesting, too, because if you match that resume, that menu there up against a timeline, and you see where the places where he happens to be at the right time, I believe, as a matter of fact, what he had a date there for Greece, right, that was rather interesting. He showed up...
Let's see, 1948 to 50, at which point the United States was basically very much involved in the Greek Civil War, which had its origins during the Second World War, when, and you'll recall, those of you who heard the first Radio Free America broadcast, or those of you who'd like to obtain that broadcast, that the Greek partisans had kicked the Nazis out during World War II. The British then undertook open combat against the Greek partisans in 1944, several months before the Battle of the Bulge. That then spread out of World War II, just like the guerrilla warfare in Eastern Europe, and then the CIA took sponsorship of the fascists and the reactionary forces in Greece, and that's where old Helmut Stryker was to that date.
Indeed. So 4 years after the Nazis have been driven out of Greece by the partisans, the CIA is bringing them right back in again in positions of power.
Now, one of the major Cold War elements that it was an institution which has been very much involved in the Cold War in terms of propaganda is something called Radio Free Europe. And of course, we've named this broadcast as a sort of a takeoff on that. We call this Radio Free America. Now, Radio Free Europe, of course, was involved in broadcasting propaganda to the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc countries. And Reinhard Gehlen figured very prominently in the formation of Radio Free Europe.
You may also remember, those of you who do follow the news, that Radio Free Europe has shown up several times lately in the news during the past couple of years because of a resurgence of, well, it's hard to say politicization because it's obviously a political thing, but apparently the political control of Radio Free Europe has gotten rather heavy-handed under the Reagan administration. We're going to touch on some more recent aspects, too, but first we're going to give you some of the early history and some of the Gehlen connections. This first section is from a book called Gehlen, Spy of the Century by E.H. Cookridge, and this is copyright 1971, published by Random House. The Soviet blockade of Berlin was accompanied by violent and effective propaganda by radio leaflets and newspapers, which was aimed at frightening West Berliners and West Germans and weakening their trust in the Allies. Hitherto, the latter had made hardly any answer to this concerted propaganda assault. Wisner, who is Frank Wisner, who we've discussed in previous broadcasts, high-ranking American intelligence official, who had early contacts with the Nazis and bringing them into the intelligence system. Wisner, advised by Gehlen and several of his radio experts, immediately went to work to remedy this situation. A powerful radio transmitter was to be established to counteract communist aggression over the ether. Even when the initial plans were still being drafted, Wisner was envisaging a chain of transmitters broadcasting in all the languages of the many nations within the Soviet orbit, which would fan discontent and encourage opposition and open rebellion against the communist rulers. Initially, there was only one American medium which could be used. This was RIAS, Radio in the American Sector. the official transmitter of the U.S. military commander in Berlin. It limited its transmission to brief bulletins, news talks, and a great deal of musical entertainment. Wisner had little difficulty in impressing upon Major General Frank L. Howley, the sector commandant, that RIAS programs must be radically revised. Gehlen provided a few experienced broadcasters, which soon brought more zip into the transmissions. But the plan of the great transmitter took some time. Wisner was unable to obtain from his superiors. He turned to American business tycoons for help. Allen Dulles, whom President Truman had asked to head a committee of 3 to investigate the effectiveness of Hillenkoetter's CIA, willingly offered his help. The 2 company lawyers passed the begging bowl along with splendid success. At that time, several private bodies in the United States, such as the Council on Foreign Relations, the Council Against Communist Aggression, Congress for Cultural Freedom, American Friends of Russian Freedom, the Free Asia Committee, and a number of, quote, citizens committees in several states and cities, some of which were to lend support to Senator Joseph McCarthy, were engaged in fighting communism in their own fashion. Dulles and Wisner enlisted the prestigious help of General Eisenhower, who had retired from his post as U.S. Chief of Staff to become the president of Columbia University, and assembled the Free Europe Committee, whose list of sponsors read like a who's who of American industry and banking. Headed by Alan Valentine, erstwhile Yale history professor and Rhodes Scholar at Oxford who had gone into big business and was a director of the Finance Securities Trust Company, the American Sulphur Corporation, and the Buffalo-Rochester-Pittsburgh Railroad, they included Clark McAdams Clifford, a director of the National Bank of Washington, C. Rodney Smith, president of American Airlines, Frank Altschul, senior partner in the banking house of Lazard Frères, C.D. Jackson of the Luce Organization, publishers of Time, Life, and Fortune magazines, A.F. Francis, chairman of the General Food Corporation, the world's largest breakfast cereal manufacturers, Henry Ford II, Edwin H. Land, president of Polaroid, and William O. Baker, vice president of the Bell Telephones Corporation. There were many more willing donors, amongst them General Motors, General Electric, Westinghouse, Chrysler, United Food, and all the oil companies, headed by Esso and Standard Oil.
So those are some of the people that Wisner turned to get the funds that he was unable to get from his immediate superiors in the early days of the CIA. Continuing now with the history of Radio Free Europe. Early in 1950, Radio Free Europe was installed in a row of prefabricated buildings in the Englischer Garten, a pleasant park in the center of Munich. Within an amazingly brief period, with an initial budget of $10 million, Radio Free Europe began its transmissions from its new, powerful station. It also used existing transmitters in several friendly countries. In the course of time, Radio Free Europe grew into a chain of 29 radio stations, beaming round-the-clock anti-communist propaganda in 16 languages to East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and the former Baltic states. Broadcasts in Albanian were eventually discontinued when it was discovered that there were very few radio receivers in Albania. A chain of transmitters was also set up in Saudi Arabia, Iran, Pakistan, Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Japan, which cover the Middle East, Africa, Asiatic Russia, Southeast Asia, and the Far East. From Frankfurt, the War of the Ether was initiated by a kindred foundation, Radio Liberty, which broadcast exclusively to the Soviet Union in a multitude of its languages and dialects, from Russian, Ukrainian, Ruthenian, Finnish, and Latvian to Turkoman, Tajik, Chuvak, and the Ural-Altaic dialects of Mongolia. The official Voice of America completed the mighty barrage, catering for listeners with sufficient knowledge of English. Gehlen eagerly cooperated from the very outset with Radio Free Europe and its supervisors from the Office of Policy Coordination, Colonel Kotek and William Griffith. He delegated as his liaison officer ex-SA Peter Fischer, who went under the alias of Major Fiedler. He had become the chief radio expert at Pulak and could boast excellent credentials. During the war, he had served in the SD in the Netherlands under SS Sturmbannführer Joseph Schreider, who had been instrumental in conducting Funkspiel radio deceptions with London, succeeding in catching by the use of fake signals nearly every SOE agent sent to the Dutch resistance from England, and also the leaders of the Resistance Council. SOE, by the way, is the British Special Operations Executive, which conducted covert operations in mainland Europe during the war, and a fellow by the name of William Stevenson, who we're going to refer to later in the broadcast, was a member of that organization, and he wrote about Gehlen as well. So Gehlen was instrumental in setting up Radio Free Europe, which basically broadcast to the communist countries and was ostensibly presenting them with the view of freedom. And it's worth noting the heavy Gehlen links with this organization, because there are indications that basically these Radio Free Europe Gehlen links have been maintained, at least to a certain extent, right up into the last few years. Now, in the second of our Radio Free America broadcasts, we talked about a Romanian Iron Guardist, a Romanian fascist, part of the Romanian native fascist movement sponsored by and allied to Nazi Germany. He was a fellow by the name of initially Viorel and later Valerian Trifa. Now, he worked for Gehlen near the end of World War II. Eventually, he became the Archbishop of the Romanian American Orthodox Episcopate and was close to, among others, J. Edgar Hoover and Richard Milhous Nixon. Specifically, was called upon by Nixon to give the opening prayer before the United States Senate in 1955. Now, he worked for Gehlen, as we saw in a book called Wanted: The Search for Nazis in America. At the end of World War II, there are indications that he went to work for that he stayed working with the Gehlen organization when Gehlen jumped to the United States. And Viorel Trifa cropped up, or Valerian Trifa cropped up on the news within several times in the last few years. And as I said, there are indications that the Gehlen organization maintains its contacts with Radio Free Europe.
All right, this next selection is an article from the San Francisco Chronicle for Wednesday, February 20th, 1980. 1980. This is a Jack Anderson column, and it's entitled RFE, or Radio Free Europe, in Hot Water. And it reads as follows: Radio Free Europe, which gets $85 million from American taxpayers each year for beaming propaganda to the communist world, has touched off a congressional investigation by broadcasting a lengthy interview with an alleged Nazi war criminal and then firing 2 employees who blew the whistle on the outrageous program. The RFE official directly responsible for the broadcast has not been reprimanded, possibly because he has a close friend and former RFE colleague on the staff of the President's National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski. Chairman John Gronowski of the Board for International Broadcasting, which supervises RFE, has appointed a special counsel to look into the matter. The interview, last May 1st, gave a sympathetic airing to the views of Valerian Trifa. Justice Department documents charge that Trifa, as a leader of the Nazi-oriented Iron Guard in his native Romania, was personally responsible for the deaths of 4,000 Jews in a 1941 pogrom. He eventually came to this country, settled in Detroit, and became a bishop of the Romanian American Orthodox Episcopate. I should just put in parenthetically here, according to Bloom, whose book Dave mentioned, he got the name Valerian, which is his bishop's name, and got his bishopship, or his bishopric, when he and a bunch of his Iron Guard thugs literally surrounded the house of the present bishop in upstate Michigan, dragged the priests out, beat them with clubs, and literally took over the leadership of the Romanian Orthodox Church, according to Bloom's book, Wanted: The Search for Nazis in America. Anyway, going back to Anderson's article, he eventually came to this country, settled in Detroit, and became a bishop of the Romanian American Orthodox Episcopate. The Justice Department is trying to deport him on grounds that he lied about his past when he became a U.S. citizen. Congressional investigators, for Representative Elizabeth Holtzman, Democrat of New York, have received evidence that, quote, the broadcast was not simply an inadvertent judgmental error, but represented a conscious management decision made over staff objections. It was, said the investigators, quote, part of a pattern of such questionable decisions with respect to both substance and personnel made over the past several years, unquote. The investigators also found that Radio Free Europe employees, quote, have been harassed and threatened for attempting publicly to expose what they consider to be the facts of this case, unquote. Indeed, 2 employees in the Romanian broadcast division, Edgar Raphael and Jacob Popper, have been fired, apparently because they told Holtzman about the Trifa situation. Radio Free Europe President Glenn Ferguson ignored a specific directive from Gronowski not to fire the 2 men. Noel Bernard, director of the Romanian service, is still riding high at Radio Free Europe. Sources say he is an old pal of Paul Henze, H-E-N-Z-E, a veteran CIA operative who is now a member of Brzezinski's White House staff. The two served together at Radio Free Europe's Munich station in the 1950s.
So a number of things to take note there. First of all, note the links between Radio Free Europe and the Nazi contingent brought into this country at the end of World War II. Valerian Trifas still being called upon to broadcast broadcast propaganda to Romania in 1979, and two employees who complain about this get fired, which would indicate that at least to a certain extent the pro-Nazi sympathies within that organization were current as of 1980. Okay, and note the link between Paul Henze, and Zbigniew Brzezinski, the Polish-born former national security advisor for President Carter. It's worth noting that Henze, of documented CIA background, is the author of a current book about the shooting of Pope John Paul II, which maintains that Pope John Paul II was in fact killed by Bulgarian Secret Service Bulgarian agents, and he implicates the KGB and so forth. Take note of Henze's CIA background.
Henze's Radio Free America propaganda background, to put an even finer point on it. Radio Free Europe propaganda background. Yes, indeed.
And also, well, the fact that Henze and Noel Bernard, the fellow who hired Trifa to broadcast for the Romanian desk of Radio Free Europe, worked together at Radio Free Europe in Munich. Now, that's at the aforementioned Englischergarten, and Gehlen's headquarters was very nearby at Pulack, near the Dachau concentration camp. Now, we're going to talk some more about connections between very prominent personages and the Gehlen organization later on in the broadcast. Now, as we indicated earlier in the program, one of the most important aspects of the Gehlen organization for American purposes here is not only the fact that all of our information about the Soviet Union for a long time came through the Gehlen organization, but the fact that that organization, the Gehlen organization, prepared the way and paved the way for literally thousands of Nazi war criminals, SS and Gestapo men, to move up into the U.S. intelligence system.
Now, many of you out there who are familiar with movies and TV and things like that may be aware of a book, and was later made into a movie by a man named Frederick Forsyth, the man who wrote The Day of the Jackal. The book and movie in question is called The ODESSA File. And the ODESSA File, the movie and book, told the story of a secret organization of ex-Nazis, all banded together to commit acts of terrorism and to protect each other, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very lively, exciting sort of a suspense book. Well, what a lot of people don't realize is that Frederick Forsyth, who himself was a journalist and had worked extensively in Europe, among other places, was talking about a very real, very actual organization that, to the best of our knowledge, certainly still exists today and has had an awful lot of effect, not only on European politics, but in fact on world politics, including those of the United States. A real organization, not something made up for the sake of a spy thriller, but a very real organization that has brought some very real, very frightening people into intimate positions of power in the Western intelligence system.
Now, the name ODESSA is actually derived, I don't know what the German is, but from basically the name, the Order of Ex-SS Men. That is exactly what it is. It is a post-war fraternal organization. It's much more than just fraternal, but it is an organization of basically the post-war alumni of Hitler's SS, and they basically, one of the purposes of the ODESSA is to see to it that the organization continues to function in allegiance to Adolf Hitler. All SS men had to swear, in addition to their rigorous Nazi training, had to swear an oath of lifetime allegiance to Adolf Hitler. And the ODESSA organization, its primary goal is to see to it, in ways peaceful and violent, that the SS men basically live in accordance with their oath, that their allegiance to Adolf Hitler continues to up until their death. And the organization, the ODESSA organization, is headed up by a fellow who you heard reference to earlier, a former SS colonel named Otto Skorzeny, last name Skorzeny. Now, Skorzeny is not only the head of the ODESSA, but basically organized the organization along the lines of a corporation. Now, much of the ODESSA's early income came from the sale of arms. Now, at the end of World War II, of course, there were a great many armaments still sitting around, and the there were still many conflicts throughout the world, and one of the things the Odessa did, one of the ways they provided funding for themselves early in the war, shortly after the war, I should say, was to traffic in arms, to get arms from where they were to where they were needed. For example, one of Odessa's first significant arms sales was a sale of a contingent of 15 Messerschmitt 109s to Israel to form one of the first fighter wings in the Israeli Air Force. And basically, through the sales of arms, getting the arms from where they were to where they were needed, the Odessa was able to finance many of its early operations and was organized, as I said, along the lines of a corporation. Now, Otto Skorzeny, during the Cold War years, put the Odessa to work for the Central Intelligence Agency and the Gehlen organization. There was a kind of a reciprocal relationship between the two. The Odessa functioned as part of the CIA under Skorzeny's direction, as we're going to read you here in a second, and in addition to that, the CIA served as a means of consolidating the Odessa, both bodily and in spirit as well. So there is a kind of a reciprocal relationship. Odessa becomes part of CIA, and that work for CIA, Skorzeny's recruiting work of SS men for CIA, as we're going to see in a minute, became one of the means for consolidating and coalescing the Odessa, kind of the way you put vinegar. Those of you who have ever poached an egg, you have to put a little bit of vinegar in the water to keep the egg from just spreading out all over. And that's how the CIA, in effect, worked for the Odessa. It became the device for causing it to coalesce. And it's worth noting also that many aspects of the U.S. intelligence apparatus were not aware of this incorporation of Odessa as part of the Gehlen organization, and there were kind of crossed signals throughout many uses of these heinous Nazi war criminals as part of the U.S. intelligence system. There are many reports given by people who weren't on the inside that, hey, you know, these monsters are moving up into the U.S. intelligence system, and they were unaware that, in fact, they were being sponsored from on high. Okay, to Skorzeny's incorporation of the Odessa into the Central Intelligence Agency. I'm going to read you now from a book called Skorzeny, subtitled Hitler's Commando. That was authored by a man named Glenn Infield, and it was copyrighted 1981, published in hardcover by St. Martin's Press. And Infield writes in Skorzeny, Hitler's Commando, "The Western powers were not too concerned with the Skorzeny movement at this time because it was small enough for their occupation troops to handle easily. Later, when the Skorzeny movement became known as the Bruderschaft, the Brotherhood, and the membership continued to grow, the West, instead of being apprehensive, encouraged its growth. The international crisis caused by the Soviets' covert and direct aggression had created a vital need for help, and Skorzeny, by this time a member of the silent conspiracy with the U.S. intelligence, promised his cooperation. From his cells at Dachau and Darmstadt, and from hiding after his escape, Skorzeny very efficiently guided the organization until by the early 1950s, it was a group to be reckoned with by those opposed to fascism and Third Reich principles." Okay. Now, speaking about how Skorzeny was, as Dave mentioned earlier, brought into the coalescing heart of the Odessa through the ages of Western intelligence, again from Skorzeny, the North Koreans had moved into South Korea on June 26, 1950, and many Allied officials thought it was a prelude to a Soviet attack on Western Europe. The United States, France, and Great Britain had only 7 undermanned divisions with which to hold West Germany from falling under the influence of the Soviets, while the Russians had 22 divisions ready, plus the new East German army. For the Western nations facing the communists in Asia and in Europe, German industrial might and Prussian military prowess both became invaluable. However, there were several embarrassing problems. Many of the German industrialists were in prison or still awaiting trial in an internment camp. Most of the prominent SS officers and men were on the run or in prison too. How could the munitions plants be rebuilt and manned by the former owners without the United States being ridiculed by the rest of the world? The Germans had been threatened with death or long years in prison for exactly the same thing that the United States now wanted them to do, except this time there would be no slave labor. And the German military manpower? That was the reason for Skorzeny's trip to Germany. As one communist reported,
Quote, Skorzeny went to Germany in 1950 to hire as many of his experienced SS men as possible to help the Americans. He first went to the Munich area, to the village of Sutten, where he moved in with a family by the name of Scholm. It was a perfect hideout for Skorzeny, who stayed there for 9 months, using the alias of Rolf Steinbauer, while contacting his SS acquaintances in Bavaria. Once again, it was a photographer who forced Skorzeny's hand. The Munich newspaper, Die Abendzeitung, getting a tip that Skorzeny was living in Sutten, sent a photographer to the village, and he secretly snapped a picture of Skorzeny. The newspaper printed it the next day with the caption, "Are Skorzeny and Steinbauer one and the same person?" Strangely enough, no police went to investigate, but journalists did, and Skorzeny promptly left Sutten to take up residence in Munich at number 31 Blumenstrasse. Rudolf J. Geiser, special agent of the U.S. Counterintelligence Corps, made a reconnaissance of the building and reported. Skorzeny, he reports, using the alias of Rolf Steinbauer, is living at number 31 Blumenstrasse, Munich, together with a former girlfriend of his by the name of Louisa Price. The building in question is a 3.5-story brick construction located at the corner of Blumenstrasse and Angertorstrasse. The ground floor of said building contains the storage rooms for a printing concern located next door. The first and second floors are occupied by the Reparations Office, Munich branch. The third floor contains the offices of a construction firm, Macher and Price, and also the living quarters of Price. A check of all doorbells and nameplates on the various doors failed to reveal the name Steinbauer. Judging from the appearance of the building, it can be considered as an ideal hideout, especially since the building is in a fairly inconspicuous locality. Skorzeny was there, all right. So was Hermann Lauterbacher, Lauterbacher. Hermann Lauterbacher, former deputy Reich leader of the Hitler Youth, who was working with the Gehlen organization and the Americans. After arranging with Lauterbacher to recruit SS officers in the Munich area, Skorzeny moved on. He spent some time in West Berlin, a feat in itself, since security measures were extremely strict in the divided city at that time. While in Berlin, he stayed with Hilda Weissner, an actress whom he knew very well during the war. Later, after he had completed his business with SS contacts in West Berlin, he and the actress went to Hamburg, and once again, Skorzeny recruited a large number of his former SS comrades. British intelligence spotted Skorzeny in Hamburg and, not knowing of his mission for the Gehlen organization, prepared to arrest him and return him to Darmstadt. It took several discreet hints from the CIA to, quote, lay off before the tenacious English agents looked the other way.
Now, again, take note of the fact that there's a kind of a reciprocal relationship between the ODESSA and the CIA, that Skorzeny, in the CIA's demand for anti-Soviet agents, took his fledgling ODESSA organization and put it to work for the CIA, and in turn that work became one of the major tools for Skorzeny to build the ODESSA organization. Now, this is a pattern that we're going to see some more in our examination of the Gehlen organization. Although the Nazis did indeed go to work for the CIA as anti-Soviet agents, at the same time the Nazis used this CIA sponsorship for the furtherance of their own aims, and those didn't always totally coincide with what Western democracy had in mind. And the semi-autonomy of the Gehlen organization and of this SS contingent in particular is something to keep in mind, because while they did work against the Soviets, they used CIA sponsorship to handle to further their own aims as well. Also, keep in mind the name of Hermann Lauterbacher. That was the name of one of the SS men that Skorzeny was recruiting during his rounding up of SS men to put to work for ODESSA and CIA, because we're going to come back to Lauterbacher later.
Again, just to wrap up this last section, a point I want to home in on, because it's very important, especially when we're working with this kind of material, because when you're talking about things that are of this magnitude and yet of this that most people are this relatively ignorant about, people accuse you of being, a conspiracy theorist and trying to put together wild scenarios where the entire world is controlled, et cetera, or an entire government top to bottom is in fact corrupt and in on secrets. Well, The answer, of course, is not as simple as people like that would pretend that it was. And obviously, this is a case where individuals could control, to some extent, an entire government top to bottom was not necessarily corrupt. But as we saw in the previous Radio Free America talking about Byelorussians, much of the people who are agreeing to fund the kind of activity that the CIA was involved in through their Nazi and Eastern European fascist proxies was being presented through the filter of one or two trusted old boy network intelligence officers like Wisner, like later Alan Dulles. As a matter of fact, we saw Frank Wisner constructing a large tissue of fabrications as to who these people were that he had hired, how they were a bunch of anti-communists on the run from persecution when in fact they were Byelorussian Nazi supporters. So it's a very difficult kind of a dance, as Dave is talking about, going on, where both sides, and specifically individuals on both sides, were using each other, and of course the people who were paying the bill were you and I, or in this case probably our parents, for some of us, the American taxpayer, as always, keeping the Nazis and the CIA happy as they waltz together across the crumbling ruins of Eastern Europe.
We're making the interest payments today.
Indeed, we certainly are.
Alrighty, now, we're going to go back to Otto Skorzeny, head of the ODESSA, and his work as the sort of head of a group of Nazi war criminals going to work for CIA and the Gehlen organization. Now, one of the names that came up in the course of the section that Nip read you from the infield book on Skorzeny was a fellow by the name of Hermann Lauterbacher. He was one of the ex-SS men that Skorzeny was recruiting for the CIA while using his CIA recruitment efforts as a device to also build the ODESSA. Now, one of the most outrageous uses of Nazi war criminals by the Gehlen organization concerned the Gehlen organization's use of a bunch of final solution veterans, that is to say, veterans of Hitler's so-called final solution to the Jewish problem, to basically help build first the Egyptian and then later, as we're going to see, the Libyan intelligence service for work against Israel. I'm going to read you an account now about that from the Cookridge book, Gehlen Spy of the Century. Next, Nasser asked Roosevelt, that's a CIA agent named Kim Roosevelt here, beginning again. Next, Nasser asked Roosevelt to help him reorganize Egypt's military intelligence and secret service in order to buttress his personal power. Political considerations meant that official employment of U.S. officers and CIA agents by the Egyptian government was out of the question, however. Thus, it came about that Dulles approached Gehlen for assistance. At that time, Gehlen was absorbed in his struggle with Wohlweber, who had taken charge of the East German Ministry for State Security after the Berlin Uprising. Nevertheless, he obliged his friend Dulles by recruiting a military mission of former officers of Hitler's army in the SS. This mission was dispatched to Egypt under ex-Waffen-SS General Wilhelm Farnbacher. In time, it grew to 200 officers. Besides the military mission, however, Nasser needed men to organize his secret service, directing espionage and training saboteurs against Israel, and also to advise on the surveillance of his many enemies inside Egypt, such as the powerful Muslim Brotherhood. Again, his American advisors turned to Gehlen, asking him to recommend someone qualified to take on the task. During the secret negotiations which followed, Gehlen thought at one stage of sending one of his own experts from Pulak. He had several men who had conducted espionage against the British during the war in Libya, Egypt, and Iran. But he could not realistically spare one of sufficiently high rank to impress Nasser. He therefore suggested his old colleague, ex-SS Sturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny of Zeppelin fame, to take on the assignment in Egypt. After the war, Skorzeny had spent 3 years in American captivity in Germany as a suspected war criminal. He had been released in July of 1948 and was living in Spain, where he had established a prosperous engineering business. He was reluctant to accept. For one thing, the Egyptians offered little financial inducement. He was promised that CIA would top up his salary from Nasser. Dulles and Gehlen also approached Skorzeny's father-in-law, Dr. Hjalmar Schacht, once Hitler's financial wizard, who, after his acquittal at Nuremberg and the quashing of his 8-year sentence under the denazification laws, had become president of a bank in Dusseldorf. So besieged from so many sides, Herr Skorzeny graciously agreed on the condition that his stay in Cairo should be limited. Skorzeny worked in Egypt for about a year, and then left Nasser's secret service in the good hands of other SS and Gestapo men. He had recruited about 50, of whom some had to be summoned from Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Spain, where they had found a safe haven from Allied prosecution as war criminals. Among his assistants was a high official of Goebbels' propaganda ministry and Himmler's RSHA, Franz Bunch, last name B-U-E-N-S-C-H, an expert on Jewish matters. He had worked with Eichmann on the final solution during the war, and had written a book entitled Sexual Habits of the Jews, which was probably the most viciously pornographic document ever produced by the Nazis. These German intelligencers in Cairo looked to Gehlen for advice, and he appointed a liaison officer to them whom he sent from Germany. He was a bird of the same feather as they, an ex-SS officer and deputy Reich leader of the Hitler Youth, Hermann Lauterbacher. Recall that's the same Hermann Lauterbacher that we were talking about just a few minutes ago, whom Skorzeny was first recruiting in Europe for work for CIA. There are indications here, a little later in this passage, that Gehlen's habit of recruiting SS men, and specifically war criminals that had been employed by Hitler in the final solution, that this practice continued even after Gehlen, along with his organization, made the jump to West Germany as the BND. And indeed, we find a very prominent war criminal working for BND in Syria. Cookridge writes, at Damascus, the BND resident was ex-SS Hauptsturmführer Alois Brunner, alias George Fischer, who posed as the director of the German-Syrian trading company Otraco. Brunner later joined Bunch in Cairo. They were old colleagues, for they had both worked under Eichmann at the RSHA Jewish department.
Okay, continuing on, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that this section here is also from Skorzeny, Hitler's Commando by Glenn Infield. This section goes into a little more detail, and another name of a rather significant individual comes up, sort of cementing another plank in the platform, to mix a metaphor, of the kinds of things that the United States was indirectly sponsoring through its use of these former SS officers to help put together and staff and train the Egyptian Secret Service. The author here is referring at first to Skorzeny, and he says as follows: his first task was to organize a staff of former SS and Wehrmacht officers to train the Egyptian army and security forces. He selected carefully, making certain that each officer he brought to Egypt was a die-hard Nazi, an expert military tactician, and was anti-Semitic. Among those recruited by Skorzeny were SS General Oskar Derlewanger, who had commanded a brigade composed of poachers, criminals, and men under the sentence of court-martial during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and whose actions against the Jews had earned him the nickname Butcher of Warsaw. SS Colonel Adolf Eichmann, the officer Himmler charged with the destruction of millions of Jews and who later would be kidnapped from Argentina by the Israeli Secret Service and smuggled back to Israel to stand trial. SS General Wilhelm Farnbacher, Panzer General Oskar Munzel, Leopold Gleim, former chief of Hitler's personal guard and Gestapo security chief of German-occupied Poland, and Joachim Demling, former chief of the Gestapo in Dusseldorf. To handle medical problems, Skorzeny recruited Dr. Hans Eisele, who had been chief medical officer at Buchenwald concentration camp, and Heinrich Willermann, former medical director at Dachau. Okay. Now, this is, again, as mentioned before, an example of the kind of continuity. Remember, we talked at the top of the show about continuity and the existence of structures and the basic whole importation of these structures directly out of Nazi Germany into the American intelligence service field, and then later there they wind up in Egypt putting together the Secret Service there only 6 or 7 years after the war is over.
Now, notice not only do Bunch and Alois Brunner wind up in the Middle East, but Adolf Eichmann himself, the fellow who is, at least according to this account by Infield, Adolf Eichmann himself. And it's worth noting that Infield was, I drew this material from an interview with Skorzeny, the fellow who led this mission. So Eichmann himself went to work, I guess, in essence, as a CIA contract agent in putting together this contingent of Final Solution veterans to work for the Egyptian Secret Service. Now, in Skorzeny, Infield also adds another interesting detail of the work that Skorzeny did while in Egypt, putting together this group of war criminals to in essence, form the Egyptian Secret Service and State Security Service. Infield writes, Skorzeny was already training an Arab Foreign Legion in commando tactics. This secret unit was comprised of 400 former Nazis and Gestapo veterans and used a training base at Bilbeis in the Delta, that of course being the Nile Delta. He also helped organize and train the first Palestine terrorists and planned their initial forays into Israel by way of the Gaza Strip about 1953 to 54. So while in the Middle East under CIA auspices, Skorzeny also puts together the first Palestinian terrorists, and of course we've heard so much about them in the intervening years.
Now, and again, an important thing to bear in mind is that specifically the United States handed this assignment over to the Gehlen operation. Gehlen handed it over to Skorzeny, and Skorzeny specifically selected these people, among other things, because of their staunch anti-Semitism, because, of course, of the situation between Egypt and Israel. So, in fact, the United States, at second hand, was specifically sending anti-Semites to train the Egyptian Secret Service. And, of course, the character of much of the Egyptian government at that time was strongly anti-Semitic. The health minister talked about Adolf Hitler being more or less his main man and one of his heroes and things of that nature, and a very, very strong emphasis of that kind. So when you hear about the beginnings of the PLO, or at least of a PLO at that time, Palestinian terrorist organizations anyway, one has to wonder, once again, if maybe we're not, in fact, reaping our own harvest in the Middle East.
Okay, now, research credit for this next article here goes to Mae Brussel, who is America's premier anti-fascist and assassination researcher, and in a certain sense could be said to be sort of the godmother of this whole Radio Free America series. She turned both Nip Tuck and myself onto the vast majority of the books that we've used in this series, and she specifically dug up this following piece of information for us. This comes from a book called Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile. This, like many of the books about Third Reich alumni, specifically chronicles the post-war activities of, among others, Martin Bormann, who, although sort of, I guess you could call pop histories of the Third Reich list him as having died, his escape and post-war activities are, in fact, very, very well documented. And Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, was authored by a former CBS correspondent and colleague of Edward R. Murrow named Paul Manning, M-A-N-N-I-N-G. The book was published in hardcover and copyrighted 1981, published by Lyle Stewart Books. And this, recall that Skorzeny's work, as reported by Glenn Infield, also involved training the first Palestinian terrorists to go into Israel, and another name which has become very much identified with modern terrorism, also touched base with these Nazi war criminals that were put together by CIA, sent to Egypt under Skorzeny, and in effect became sort of a little, as he put it, an Arab Foreign Legion, basically a little final solution contingent in the Middle East. Manning writes as follows. Colonel Gaddafi of Libya, then the new revolutionary leader of his country, asked Nasser to make the German team of advisors available to him also. This was done, and upon arrival the Germans started with a thorough house cleaning of the Libyan Secret Service hired by the previous ruler, King Idris. 2,000 Libyan police were put in jail and continue to languish there today, and the Germans rebuilt from scratch. Today, Libyan intelligence agents are stationed in all Libyan, African, and overseas embassies and consulates, and they are tough and ruthless. Perhaps as a quid pro quo to this service to Libya, the colonel granted the West German rocket company Otrag rights to a vast test range 600 miles south of Tripoli in 1980. So not only is the Egyptian Secret Service put together by these Nazi war criminals, but the Libyan intelligence service as well. And this little passage here where he notes overseas embassies are staffed with these efficient and ruthless Libyan intelligence agencies has considerable meaning for us here in the spring and early summer of 1984.
Indeed, most of you out there will remember, of course, the incident that actually led to the breaking off of diplomatic relations between Libya and Great Britain, when in fact some unnamed person who was never apprehended because he was allowed to leave the country shot an English policewoman to death and wounded several anti-Gaddafi demonstrators in London in front of the Libyan embassy. Also, on the subject of Gaddafi, now, Muammar Gaddafi is going to appear at great length in a later Radio Free America, probably in August, in tangent with his, well, one hesitates to say good buddies, but certainly his associates, Ed Wilson, Frank Turple, and Gary Corcola, all supposedly ex-CIA agents of doubtful pedigree, and all interesting in a variety of ways. But once again, Gaddafi shows up quite interestingly, especially in this context, because again and again we have been told that Gaddafi is a pro-Soviet, leftist supporter of terrorism. In fact, as we've noted in other broadcasts here on KFJC, Gaddafi is a participant with Otto Skorzeny in groups like the Paladin Group, which are actually members of the International Fascista, and we have these connections here, his direct connections early on to Skorzeny, and essentially importing the Nazi final solution experts right into his country to train his own secret service, which, as almost anybody can tell you, is probably the only thing keeping the man in power at this point in Libya, because he is certainly not a very popular ruler. Anyway, on the subject, though, since we're not going to go into it too deeply tonight, on the subject of Turple and Wilson and others, a local writer by the name of Pete Carey, working for the San Jose Mercury, was in fact, as we'll explain more after we read this article, was doing some research on those self-same folks, most notably Frank Turple and his rather interesting series of connections to various political events. In the course of his research, and again, that also we'll explain a little more in a moment, he came across a rather interesting individual that should hopefully hammer home to those of you who are not familiar with this material how local and how quickly local some of this stuff can get.
Now, keep in mind that Frank Turple and Edwin Wilson, quote, unquote, CIA agents, were instrumental in arming and training Gaddafi's Secret Service as well, and his terrorist organizations, which have received so much publicity. And Frank Turple was actually affiliated with another Gehlen veteran and another Final Solution veteran, another Eichmann, this is not a subordinate, but an Eichmann superior within the SS and the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, the SS intelligence service, and this is a fellow Nip's going to tell you about right now.
Indeed. The gentleman in question, and I use the term gentleman very loosely, as people have noted who have listened to our broadcast before, was a man by the name of Otto von Bolschwing. Again, note, not only was this man high-ranking SS and SD man, but in fact spent his last years right here in the Bay Area with numerous connections in the Silicon Valley business world. Okay, this article that we're going to be reading from comes from the San Jose Mercury for November 20th, 1981. Again, the article was put together by Pete Carey in the course of what was originally an investigation into Frank Turple and others. And the article is headlined, Ex-Nazi's Brilliant U.S. Career Strangled in a Web of Lies. For the past 10 years, Otto Albrecht Alfred von Bolschwing's carefully constructed life in America has been coming apart a piece at a time. He was president of a high-technology investment firm with headquarters in Sacramento and subsidiaries in the Silicon Valley. It went bankrupt in a 1971 scandal. He was a doting husband until his ailing wife killed herself in 1978. He numbered among his business associates millionaires, bankers, and scientists. Then his brainstem was hit by a rare disease 2 years ago, sending him into isolation at a Carmichael rest home. He told friends he had worked for the Americans during and after World War II. But in May, the federal government began proceedings to deport him for lying about his Nazi past. And I should just mention in passing here that Otto von Bolschwing did die a couple of months after this article was written. In a widely publicized attempt to revoke von Bolschwing's citizenship, the Justice Department accused him of helping Hitler's persecution of European Jews and of being an associate of Adolf Eichmann, the architect of Germany's mass-killing program. The disclosures come at the end of a long, improbable career that took von Bolschwing through the Nazi hierarchy, into the CIA, and finally to the highest levels of American business. The list of people he knew, some of whom he met through a California high-technology business venture in 1970, reads like a who's who. They include Justice William A. Newsom of the First District Court of Appeals in San Francisco, Helene von Dahm, President Reagan's personal secretary, Thomas, we'll talk about her more later, by the way, Thomas A. Franzioli, banker to the Boston Cabot family, Emmanuel Thanakis, Fairchild Corporation Senior Vice President, Elmer Bopst, President of Warner Lambert Pharmaceutical Company, and Alfred Driscoll, former New Jersey governor and Warner Lambert's chairman. Quote, "I'm nonplussed," Justice Newsom said. "I thought, if anything, Otto had been pro-American during the war." As a businessman, von Bolschwing was vague about the war years. He said he had been a Gestapo prisoner and had worked for the CIA in post-war Germany. In 1969, he was asked about his German past during a job interview with Trans-International Computer Investment Corporation, a high-flying investment firm that had founded several companies in the Silicon Valley. Von Bolschwing told his interviewer he had been a lawyer. Quote, "During what years was that?" he was asked, according to a transcript of the interview. Quote, "Until I was thrown in the Gestapo prison in 1942, von Bolschwing responded. "That was not a good experience. One should forget it because it only is a negative approach to life to think about bad things." After a moment's reflection, he added, quote, "I think it would be better to speak about recent times than God knows how many years ago." Who was this ex-Nazi, and how did he prosper in America? Von Bolschwing's attorney would not allow an interview. This account was developed from people who knew him, accounts of Nazi Germany, court records, and business files. Born October 15, 1909 to East Prussian nobility, the family estate was founded in 1302, von Bolschwing attended school in Breslau and became a Nazi Party member at the age of 24, the only member of his family to do so. He joined the SS, the elite secret police of the Nazis, 6 years later. According to the Justice Department, as an SS captain, he helped plan the exclusion of Jews from the German economy and developed anti-Jewish propaganda to force their emigration from Germany. In A History of the SS by Heinz Herner, von Bolschwing is described as, quote, "a party member, an SD, foreign intelligence informer, and an experienced salesman in the motor trade." In 1938, quote, "he was in contact with a group of Palestinian Germans who lined their pockets by certain extramural intelligence activities," according to Herner, who wrote that von Bolschwing spied on the Zionist Haganah army. Ejected from Palestine by the British for espionage, he surfaced in Romania as a government, quote, "oil expert." By his own account, in 1941 he helped the leadership of the Iron Guard, a right-wing movement, escape to Berlin after it had gone on a 3-day rampage in which many Jews, the estimates vary considerably, were brutally killed.
Of course, that pogrom there was led by Valerian Triefer, the fellow who we talked about in the second Radio Free America broadcast and who broadcast for Radio Free Europe, went to work for Gehlen after the war.
Indeed. The same year, he became partner in an Amsterdam bank, the Bank voor Onroerende Zaken. Investigators said they suspect the bank may have played a role in the, quote, "Aryanization," the forced sale of Dutch Jewish farms, businesses, homes, and securities. In August 1941, von Bolschwing was tossed into a Gestapo prison with no formal charges. And in April 1942, he was just as mysteriously released. In 1945, he helped American troops entering Austria catch Nazi officials and SS officers, according to a letter written for von Bolschwing by a colonel in the 71st U.S. Infantry. The war over, von Bolschwing made a move crucial to his future success. He became an American spy. Quote, "He knocked on the door of U.S. Army intelligence," a source explained, and said, "I'm experienced. I have a ring operating. If you give me a paycheck, I'll make you very happy." He was sort of a miniature Reinhard Gehlen.
Gehlen was the Nazi general who helped the CIA build a spy network in post-war Eastern Europe, then became head of post-war German intelligence activities. According to one unconfirmed report, von Bolschwing became the controller of Gehlen's CIA operation after Gehlen returned to German government. He must have done something right, the source said. In December of 1953, von Bolschwing applied to immigrate to the United States, and on February 2nd, 1954, he arrived in this country. After obtaining several menial jobs, he became a citizen in 1959, and his career took a sudden, upward turn. He became an assistant to the director of international marketing at Warner Lambert Pharmaceutical Company, developing close ties to the company's president and the late Elmer Bobst and its honorary board chairman, former New Jersey Governor Alfred Driscoll, according to a close associate. His contacts at Warner Lambert were way out of proportion with his job, the associate said. Driscoll continued to write him recommendations for many years, unquote. By the mid-1960s, von Bolschwing had become an executive with Cabot Manufacturing. As chief financial officer for its German subsidiary, he developed a $50 million carbon black factory for Cabot in Germany. The deal was financed through Thomas Franzioli, senior vice president of the First National Bank of Boston. Franzioli recalls that von Bolschwing then branched out on his own. He was starting a business importing wine from Argentina, Franzioli recalled. I don't know if it ever got off the ground. In March of 1969, von Bolschwing got a job in high technology. He was retained as an international business consultant by TCI, the Sacramento firm. The company planned to commercialize on technology developed in the Silicon Valley and used a few years earlier to monitor troop movements in the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, according to the firm's founder, Oswald S. Williams. TCI's subsidiaries in Palo Alto and Mountain View, Advanced Information Systems, and International Imaging Systems, were developing a high-volume computer network for business and a navigation system for oil tankers using satellite communications, Williams said. The company also did classified work for the Department of Defense. Ours was going to be a sensitive thing, Williams explained. We all had to have security clearances. Von Bolschwing was brought in because, quote, we wanted contacts in Europe, and he had them, Williams said. A TCI memo written in 1969 reported that its new consultant, quote, has extremely valuable connections and information in Germany, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, the Netherlands Antilles, and South America. Mr. von Bolschwing's connections in these countries are current, unquote. His contacts included officials of the German branch of Chase Manhattan Bank and an owner of the Berliner Handelsgesellschaft in Frankfurt, one of Europe's largest banks, the memo said. TCI's high-powered directors, one was J. Paul Getty, Jr., son of the oil billionaire, thought enough of von Bolschwing to make him the firm's president in 1970. He seemed like a very polite and cultured person, said Walter F. Leverton, former vice president for satellite systems of the Aerospace Corporation. Leverton sat on the board of TCI. Justice Newsom, who traveled as a TCI attorney with von Bolschwing in Europe in 1969 to 70, said von Bolschwing alluded to wartime work for the Americans. He was suave and plausible, Newsom said. He seemed to have all the credentials. He looked kind of world-weary, recalled Newsom. He had the long cigarette holder, his hair was slicked back. Emanuel Thanakis, who had resigned as an international telephone and telegraph vice presidency to sign on with TCI, also traveled with von Bolschwing in Europe, meeting his banking and industry contacts. Otto was very pleasant and soft, Thanakis said. He talked about his past of working for intelligence. I don't know if it was the CIA or what, but after the war, he helped the United States and the Allies to find Nazis. Records and interviews with TCI officials indicate that Helena von Dahm, President Reagan's Austrian-born deputy assistant, translated some German contracts for TCI and invested $1,000 in it while she was then Governor Reagan's secretary in Sacramento. Von Dahm was too busy, unquote, to talk about von Bolschwing, but through her White House secretary said she knew him socially in Sacramento many years ago. Justice Department investigators had stumbled across the name of Otto von Bolschwing in 1979 while working on the case of Valerian Trifa, a leader of the Iron Guard's anti-Jewish rampage in Romania. Investigators had found Trifa in Detroit, and in investigating him, they interviewed von Bolschwing. He admitted helping Trifa and other Iron Guard members escape Romania after the 1941 pogrom. But in a sworn statement, he denied ever having been a member of the SS, the SD, or the Nazi Party. Well, that is certainly quite a bit to contemplate there. All of the big names that von Bolschwing touches bases with. First of all, take note of the report that he was head of Gehlen's North American operation after Gehlen jumped back to West Germany as head of the BND. Some of the names here that are worth noting, this Governor Alfred Driscoll, affiliated former chairman of the board of Warner Lambert Pharmaceuticals. Albert Driscoll was the man who placed Richard Nixon's name into nomination at the 1968 Republican Convention. And, of course, keep in mind the Trifa-Nixon connection that we've talked about in the past. And Another thing that's worth noting here is the many connections between between von Bolschwing and some of the same industrial operations which we talked about in connection with the American Nazi industrial axis, which had a great deal to do with building Nazi industrial power. Note IT&T here. One of its vice presidents, Emanuel Thanakis, went to work for TCI, traveled with von Bolschwing, as we mentioned in our Uncle Sam and the Swastika broadcast. An ITT subsidiary, the Lorenz Company, manufactured the Focke-Wulf aircraft for Nazi Germany, and ITT also built a lot of electrical parts for Nazi Germany as well. You'll recall in the section about Radio Free Europe, both the Ford and Standard Oil financial empires were involved with financing Radio Free Europe and the Gehlen contingent within that. And, of course, also we've seen that von Bolschwing had contact with the Chase Manhattan Bank. And Chase Manhattan, as we have looked at in the past, Chase Manhattan was involved with freezing the accounts of Jewish investors in its Paris branch even before the Third Reich requested such a freezing, and they worked very, very closely with the Third Reich. And of course, in this whole interview here, this whole article, I should say, perhaps the name that jumps out the most is that of Helena von Dahm. And this article identifies her as President Reagan's Austrian-born deputy assistant. She basically was responsible for drawing up the list from which all of Reagan's cabinet appointees were named, and were made, I should say. And note that von Bolschwing, who certainly spoke German himself, picked her, of all people, to do translating for these documents for TCI. Noted that she also invested in TCI while then Governor Reagan's secretary. Now, the von Dahm-von Bolschwing connection is one that certainly bears investigating and bears, well, having more light shed on it, as we like to say in these broadcasts, food for thought, grounds for further research, because Helena von Dahm has certainly not been idle, and her connections to a high-ranking Nazi war criminal. Now, keep in mind that von Bolschwing was Eichmann's superior. Von Bolschwing, among other things, was arranging for cooperation between the SS and the Haganah during World War II, and as that Höhne passage indicated. And the von Dahm-von Bolschwing connection here certainly bears a lot of scrutiny, just as the Triefer-Nixon connection did.
Among other things that bear scrutiny is the rise that Helena von Dahm has made within the Reagan administration. Let me just real quickly read an article, and then I'm going to add something to it. This article is from the San Francisco Chronicle for Tuesday, August 3rd, 1982. The article is headlined, "Big Promotion for Reagan's Ex-Secretary." Now, let me just say one thing, just that I thought it was kind of amusing as I was reading through this very, very short little blip here, is they talk, the article headlines, and I'm sure it says, "Big Promotion." See if you can tell the difference from this article between what she was doing and what she was promoted to. Once again, big promotion for Reagan's ex-secretary from the Chronicle, August of '82. President Reagan announced yesterday in Des Moines that he will promote Helena von Dahm to the position of Assistant to the President for Presidential Personnel. She will replace E. Pendleton James, who is returning to the private sector, according to the White House announcement. Von Dahm, formerly Reagan's secretary, has worked with him since his first campaign for governor of California in 1966. She is now Deputy Assistant to the President and Director of Presidential Personnel. Okay, let me just give you those two titles again, just because it's rather interesting. She is being promoted to the position of Assistant to the President for Presidential Personnel. This is a big promotion from her current position as Deputy Assistant to the President and Director of Presidential Personnel. You figure out what that means. Anyway, one of the things significant, of course, is that Helena von Dahm's position did put her in an area where she could influence selectees or possible selectees for government positions. However, since then, Helena von Dahm's fortunes have risen yet again. She is currently, as last heard, the American ambassador to Austria. So she has risen from being Ronald Reagan's personal secretary to now being the ambassador from the United States to Austria. So a fairly significant rise. Once again, as Dave says, food for thought and grounds for further research, something to be looked into, and certainly the matter of going over to translate German contracts for a corporation with a German president, and instead of being paid for it, apparently giving them $1,000 to invest, while she was at the same time President Reagan's secretary, at that time Governor Reagan's secretary. Anyway, kind of a weird story, but once again, just something to note. The proximity, the geographical proximity of some of these affairs. We have probably the North American chief of the Gehlen organization actually living and working out of the Bay Area, right here where we sit.
Okay, now keep in mind also that von Bolschwing, basically Pete Carey came across von Bolschwing while following the trail of Frank Turple, who his ex-CIA status is very doubtful, as we'll talk about in the program that we do on the Turple-Wilson connection. And keep in mind that Gaddafi's Secret Service put together by the Gehlen contingent of Nazi war criminals we talked about before. And again, the Turple-von Bolschwing connection and the Gaddafi-Gehlen connection is a very interesting one for our purposes here. Well, the question, of course, remains, what kind of a person was Reinhard Gehlen? I mean, he had such a massive role upon World War II history, I should say, post-World War II history, that the question must remain, must be asked here, what kind of a person was the aforementioned Reinhard Gehlen? Now, I guess in a book we're going to talk about here in just a second, a book called The Bormann Brotherhood, the author says that the glimpse of mass killers that we've seen gives us a clue as to the character of their employer. Well, we're going to go into specifically an interview that this very same man, a man named William Stevenson, had with Reinhard Gehlen. Now, we're going to be talking about a book we're going to be reading from now, I should say, a book called, as I said, The Bormann Brotherhood. This was authored by a man named William Stevenson, a former British intelligence agent, not to be confused with the William Stevenson of Intrepid fame. His name is spelled S-T-E-P-H-E-N-S-O-N. This William Stevenson is S-T-E-V-E-N-S-O-N. Same name, both former British intelligence agents, but of a very different mindset, so don't confuse them. Bormann Brotherhood was published in softcover in 1974, copyrighted 1974, by Bantam Books. And William Stevenson was one of the very few print journalists ever granted a lengthy interview with Reinhard Gehlen. And in the Bormann Brotherhood, he describes Gehlen as follows. Speaking of Gehlen, he had been described as, quote, ruthless in his determination to recreate the German Reich by Major Hermann Baun. At one time, Baun was regarded as the best Russian expert within German military intelligence. Baun was got rid of, dying so miserably that much hostility was created against Gehlen, even among those who shared his nationalist ambitions. One reason for Baun's elimination was that in 1946, he had cooperated a little too closely with the British Secret Service for his own good. He had described the plans made during the war for escape, and his report linked Gehlen with such prominent figures as Otto Skorzeny. Still later, in talking about a very famous Nazi hunter named Beata Klarsfeld, Gehlen speaks as follows here to William Stevenson. Beata Klarsfeld plays the communist game, Gehlen told me. Is it true she married a Jew? His secretary, Annalora Allo Kruger, inclined her head. Doubtless that explains it, Gehlen said. And on about a page later, as an interesting insight here by William Stevenson. The face seemed familiar, a face I realized later, astonishingly like that of Hitler. The feeling grew when I talked with him later. A small man with curious pointed ears, slow-moving blue eyes, and a neat little mustache.
Indeed, a very familiar description. One of the things that is going to be in this next section, continuing with the interview and Stevenson's impressions of the interview, is going to be a mention of a man named Freak, F-R-I-C-K. We would say Frick. It's Freak. Believe the first name is Wilhelm. Freak owned the house that Gehlen set up in. Freak himself was not around to own that property anymore because Freak had been shot for, among other things, at the end of the war because of the fact that he had been the person who signed the law for the protection of German blood, one of the profoundest and strongest measures that was part of the impetus leading up to the final solution. Now, one of the interesting little sidelights of the fate of Freak, so to speak, is the fact that the gentleman, again in the term used loosely, who designed those laws for the preservation of German blood, a man by the name of Hans Glubke, who we talked about at some length last Radio Free America broadcast, in fact not only was not shot, as the man who signed it was, but in fact went on to become the most powerful man in post-World War II Germany as special assistant to Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, and in fact was the man who everything had to go through to get to Adenauer, and in fact was also the person who was himself ultimately responsible in the Chancellery for the Gehlen organization. So that's Glubke, the man who made up the laws for preservation of the German blood, winds up becoming the most powerful man in the Chancellery. The man who signed them is shot, and Reinhard Gehlen later goes on to inhabit his property, and that's where this interview is taking place. And that's why Stevenson is thinking about it. From Stevenson's book, The Bormann Brotherhood, speaking of Reinhard Gehlen, he writes, he, Gehlen, saw himself as the guardian of Germany's traditional institutions. He felt responsible for rescuing the only Nazi German organization and maintaining continuity almost unbroken from becoming head of foreign armies east to chief of the Gehlen organization aimed at Russia. I'm going to reread that because that echoes so closely from Gehlen's own mouth what Carl Oglesby was saying that when we led the broadcast off with his selection. Gehlen saw himself as the guardian of Germany's traditional institutions. He felt responsible for rescuing the only Nazi German organization and maintaining continuity almost unbroken from becoming head of Hitler's foreign armies east to chief of the Gehlen organization aimed at Russia. He quoted a politician of 50 years ago who had said, quote, Germany and Japan are the natural opponents of any Russian expansion, but the British Empire and the United States in the long run are the most threatened, unquote. Now there, said Gray Fox, a nickname for Gehlen, was true perception. If a man could see historical trends half a century ahead, how much more effectively this could be done with modern methods of analysis. Absolute freedom of the press was dangerous. There must be ways of screening officialdom from public scrutiny. My eyelids began to droop, says Stevenson. Freak must have sounded like this. If the war had turned out differently, Reinhard Gehlen's name would have been inscribed in the 1,000-year Reich's Hall of Fame. His words showed no change of heart. SS men were put at the disposal of the Egyptian government, quote, to inject expertise into the Egyptian Secret Service. He still betrayed indignation at the way the British during the war, quote, pumped out propaganda against us through the BBC.
Still later, William Stevenson writes as follows in The Bormann Brotherhood. The grandfather clock bonged. Tea was brought and sponge cake. The Gray Fox, a very common nickname for Gehlen here, the Gray Fox droned on. Willy Brandt's Eastern policy had been plotted secretly a meeting in Rome between West German socialists and Italian communists. Gehlen, I found out later, repeated this accusation in his memoirs with no other documentation than unnamed intelligence sources. No wonder Gray Fox's own political supporters wanted him to keep quiet. He could say unblinkingly that the Secret Service should be used to fight Willy Brandt, appeasement, communism, in fact everything that did not accord with his right-wing friends. It never occurred to him that a new generation of Germans might be put off by his authoritarian views. If this sounds like an abuse of hospitality, I can only say that General Gehlen is a specimen worthy of study in the way the previous resident in that place by the lake, Freak, considered some condemned prisoners warranted closer examination. Interrupting here, this is a very interesting passage that Stevenson has, basically in comparing, by the way, Freak, Gehlen, I should say, lived in Freak's former house on Lake Starnberg, and what he's really saying here in the passage is that Gehlen should have had his head cut off and preserved in embalming fluid for further study. Repeating that last paragraph again. If this sounds like an abuse of hospitality, I can only say that General Gehlen is a specimen worthy of study in the way the previous resident in that place by the lake, Freak, considered some condemned prisoners warranted closer examination. When Freak was Reich Minister of the Interior and Gray Fox was shadowboxing the Bolsheviks, this order went out. The war against the Bolsheviks offers an opportunity of overcoming the shortage of skulls for the Heredity Research Center. The Jewish Bolshevik commissars, embodying as they do a revolting but characteristic example of subhumanity, give us the opportunity. After the Jew has been done to death, whereby the head must not be damaged, the officer should sever the head from the body and dispatch it in preserving fluid. It may be bad, returning here to Stevenson's account, it may be bad form to recall these things while taking tea and sponge cake with a general who boasts that as Secret Service chief, he knew all about practically everything, and then adds without visible embarrassment that naturally his work did not concern itself with the bestial manifestations of Nazi security work. But Gray Fox was the kind of man who would never, ever understand the effect upon ordinary people of what he was saying or what he had done. Not openly.
Okay, continuing on with a few more observations from William Stevenson, again reading from the Bormann Brotherhood, he says, "A curious habit of General Gehlen, I noticed, was that he copied one's gestures. It was unnerving at first, and then perhaps revealing. I would lean to one side of the chair and fold my arms, and so would he. If, in talking, I lifted a hand to make a point, his hand went up in response. He was, it seemed, fit as a fiddle, not uneasy, not uncomfortable, as elderly people sometimes are, because they try to cover up some infirmity. Pouring a drink, his hand was steady, so it was just a curious habit. His hand twitching his ear, when my hand twitched mine." Moving along, and back to Gehlen's conversation, Stevenson reports, Gehlen's real criticism of Hitler was that he lost the war because he ignored professional advice. Gehlen remained philosophically a Nazi, though, like all army officers, he did not join the Nazi Party. Skipping on down. "I knew now," writes Stevenson, "why Gehlen disturbed me and aroused the most profound sense of outrage. He had never fired a gun in anger, but his room was hung with photographs of himself on the firing range, arms outstretched, with pistol cocked, the stereotype of the figures one associates with the Nazi period, in ankle-length leather coat of black, and black peaked cap."
Well, one more detail here that we're going to provide concerning Gehlen's personal life is basically what he did after his supposed retirement from the BND, from his formal involvement with intelligence work, at least in as much as he would let on. Back to Spy the Century by Cookridge. And keep in mind, this book was written in 1971. Today, on the threshold of 70 years and 10, General Reinhard Gehlen has found a surprising new field of activities. He has become an evangelist. With still unimpaired energy, he has taken over the direction of a campaign for building new churches and schools for the Evangelical Church in Catholic Bavaria. After a life of seclusion, he frequently attends meetings all over the province at which appeals for new funds are launched. On occasion, he does not disdain to visit members of his religious community in order to encourage the enterprise and to pass the begging bowl. This shows both determination and courage, for in some of the rural districts of proverbially papist Bavaria, one conducts such campaigns at one's peril. It's worth noting that basically the recent, well, I guess you could say last 5 or 6 years have seen the rise of what has been termed by the press the religious right, and the organizations such as Moral Majority and so forth. And it's at least worth speculating here in perhaps a somewhat light vein that if Reinhard Gehlen's Eastern Front Intelligence Organization was called Foreign Armies East, perhaps the Moral Majority is Foreign Armies West. And in a not-so-light vein, I think it's worth noting here that the connections of Reinhard Gehlen to religious institutions are certainly not limited to Protestant organizations, and the fact that he was doing his evangelical church work in Catholic Bavaria would not have proved dangerous to him, and in apparently a very dogmatically Catholic Bavaria. That's not surprising in light of the fact that, as we're going to see in a future Radio Free America broadcast, Reinhard Gehlen received a very high award, specifically the Gran Crocito al Merito, from an organization called the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, or the Knights of Malta. That basically is the military arm, the lay military arm of the church, and Reinhard Gehlen received that church's highest award, only the fourth man in the 1,000-year history of that organization, dating back to the Crusades, to do so. And so maybe his seeming impunity in promoting Protestantism in Catholic Bavaria is not as surprising as you might think.
Indeed, and it's not that far away around that circle, because if there's anything that the evangelical religious right in this country and the religious right of the Catholic Church is personified in the Sovereign Military Order of Malta have in common, it's a very strong belief in the propaganda value of a quote-unquote heavenly injunction against communism, and a willingness to a religious resolution to go into a shooting war if necessary to keep Bolshevism from spreading across the world, et cetera, et cetera. So something anyway to think about, perhaps, and something to leave you with. We're going to take a short break before coming back for phone calls. The number here is going to be 415-941-2500.
Any questions that you have, don't hesitate to bombard us here, because this is by no means all of the stuff that we have on Reinhard Gehlen. We thought we'd just throw out some of the main aspects of the Gehlen organization, because we're going to be coming back to Gehlen again and again. He figured very prominently in the assassination of President Kennedy, in the recent shooting of Pope John Paul II, and in many other organizations. So we're going to touch back on the Gehlen base time and again. So, there's a lot of material left uncovered here. Don't hesitate to ask us about it.
Indeed, and also, since we had so little time for phone calls on the previous Radio Free Americas, please feel free to bring up anything that you might have had left over from those broadcasts. Anyway, once again, I guess we can sort of leave on that note of Reinhard Gehlen in his black leather German Army jacket and black leather peaked cap, out there handing out pamphlets for Christ, and a bulwark against the Bolshevists. And this is Nip Tuck. Dave Emery and myself will be right back with the next segment, and your phone calls at 415-941-2500 of Radio Free America. Mentioning again, coming up in July, on July 8th and 15th specifically, is going to be a re-airing of Dave's and my production of The Guns of November, which was originally aired in the 4 weeks of November of last year, and that is going to be July 8th, 3 p.m. to 9 p.m., and July 15th, 3 p.m. to 10 p.m. So specifically, just the information we've cut out, musical breaks, et cetera, as much as possible to render it down as economically as we can and save you folks some money on oxide. Once again, July 8th, 3 p.m. to 9 p.m., and July 15th, 3 p.m. to 10 p.m.
And you're going to hear more about the Gehlen organization on the Guns of November, because basically that organization was very much involved with the assassination of President Kennedy. While we're waiting for the lines to fill up here, 415-941-2500, tell you about a couple of other pieces of information that we're going to get to in future shows, future Radio Free America shows that will involve the Gehlen organization. Now we took a look at Valerian Trifa's connections to Richard Nixon, also the Trifa von Bolschwing connection. It's worth noting that a BND agent named Hans Langemann was engaged not only in deep-sixing some CIA information which would have documented the Nazi connections of former Nazi Chancellor Kurt Kiesinger, which we looked at in the second of the Radio Free America broadcasts, but was also involved with, among other things, getting an agent of influence close to then-President Richard Nixon. Now, this is not when he was vice president, when he he tapped Valerian Trifa to give the opening prayer before the U.S. Senate. This is when he was president, and that agent of influence, recruited by Langemann, was described as a prominent Bay Area Republican. Also, Hans Langemann eventually became chief of security for the 1972 Olympics in Munich, Germany, which, of course, were victimized by terrorists linked by many to, among others, Muammar Gaddafi, whose Secret Service was put together by Gehlen. And that man, Hans Langemann, that information, by the way, from two articles from the New York Times on March 8th of 1982, and also March 19th of 1980, or March 9th, I believe it was, of 1982, and March 19th of 1982. And research credit for both of those go also to Mae Brussel. And interestingly enough, Hans Langemann also ran a BND spy ring inside of the Vatican for a time in the 1960s. That information from a book called O Vatican, recently published, and that authored by New York Times correspondent Paul Hoffman. Okay, a couple of other bits that we're going to be getting to about Gehlen in the future.
And one last interesting thing that, again, no information at this point on, but rather interesting that BND agent Langemann's agent of influence was apparently recruited from prominent Bay Area Republicans at much the same time as Otto von Bolschwing, a Gehlen connection, and through him connected to the BND, was in fact prominent in business and making contacts with political leaders in the Bay Area at that time. So maybe something to look forward to as far as research goes. Okay, going to the phones now, and the first call appears to be long distance. We're going to take it for that reason first, and it's from Murphy's. Good evening and welcome to Radio Free America.
Hi.
Hello.
I want you to know we just really, really appreciate your program.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, how far away is Murphy's from here?
About 153 miles.
My goodness. Well, we're getting a good signal tonight. Well, glad we could have you with us.
Okay, I want to recommend a book that let everybody know that this didn't start with the end of the war. It was the preliminary, the groundwork for all this was laid prior to the war with the German-American Bund and all kinds of goodies that they had going here in the United States. And I'd like to recommend a book called Undercover by John Roy Carlson, published by E.P. Dutton in 1943. And the subtitle on that is My 4 Years in the Nazi Underworld of America, the amazing revelation of how the Axis agents and our enemies within are now plotting to destroy the United States.
And it's a fascinating book. Dave and I both have copies at home. I think we've even used them from time to time. It's a hard book to find.
Aha.
By the way, John Roy Carlson is actually the pen name. His real name was Arthur Derounian, D-E-R-O-U-N-I-A-N. He was an undercover FBI informant who was actually acting on assignment for the FBI to infiltrate the Nazi sympathetic network in this country.
It's a fascinating book, and if we know that this started before, then it's not quite, as shocking. We know they've been working all the time.
Right, certainly, and making a lot of contacts with groups like William Dudley Pelley Silver Shirts and other groups of that sort within the United States. Very true, and a good point.
I want to thank you guys an awful lot because I had the feeling that we lost the war, but nobody told us.
Well,
the Japanese and the Germans won. We didn't win.
There's a joke.
It all fell into place with listening to you.
There's a joke which was very popular during the Nixon administration, which would also apply equally well, I think, during the Reagan administration, because the same officials have been employed. But the joke went something like, well, it's a good thing that we didn't lose World War II, otherwise all our officials would have been named Schultz, Weinberger, Kissinger, and Ruckelshaus.
You did it.
And everybody be driving Japanese and German cars.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much for your call.
Take care of yourself.
All right.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And before the end of the broadcast tonight, we will, as we mentioned, Undercover, under the pen name John Roy Carlson, is a hard book to find. We will, before the end of the show tonight, to give you a chance to get pen and paper, mention at least one place where you may have a good chance of tracking that book down. So grab something to write with, and we will provide that information. Anyway, we do have a line open at 415-941-2500. Good evening, Palo Alto, and welcome to KFJC and Radio Free America.
Hi.
Hello.
I was kind of interested to hear you maybe expand a little bit more on the this Syrian and PLO thing. One of the things I was just really confused by is that it seemed to me, certainly in the last few years, when I have become politically aware, they have always been the communist linked, very strongly. All their weapons come from Russia and things like that. And maybe also you might have a comment or two on the recent troubles in the PLO with sort of their, civil war, and whereas all the troops aren't really so loyal to Yasser Arafat.
Right, right. Okay. Do you want to take those on the air or off the air?
Oh, sure, on the air would be fine. But yeah, it's just something I'm sort of confused about. It's probably a whole nother program at least.
It practically could be. And one of the things actually that on this same subject that's quite interesting is that we had read some material from, I believe it was Alexander Coburn in the Village Voice. He had put together a column quoting such people as Albert Einstein and Hannah Arendt, both very well known, talking about the background of Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir, and in fact their early links to fascism. And in part, a lot of this can be explained in the fact that both the Israelis and the Arabs originally made many of their contacts with fascism because that was one of the best ways and the easiest ways to get help against Britain in the Middle East. And so that's the genesis of a lot of these things. Now, as far as the later contacts with communism, a lot of the PLO stuff, especially their weaponry, as far as I can tell, and I'm not an expert on it, but as far as I can tell, it comes in second and third hand from a lot of other countries, a lot of other Arab countries, and partially because for so long the U.S. has been the champion of Israel in the Middle East. That's where Israel gets, most of their defense materials from. A lot of the Arab countries get their defense materials and have for a long time from the Soviet Union, although they also do from the United States. So, for one reason, the PLO has been largely supplying themselves with the cast-offs or the black market weaponry from countries that are getting their weapons, above the counter from communist countries.
Is the caller still on the line?
Yes.
Okay, caller, let me ask you a question about your second question first, and then get into a little bit of the substance from your first. When you were out talking about the divisions within the PLO, were you, in essence, sort of behind the scenes, sort of asking, are those divisions in any way affiliated with alternate, say, Western or right-wing and left-wing elements within PLO? In other words, say, Nazi or CIA-affiliated PLO links and Soviet-affiliated links?
Well, that it did seem to me to be certainly possible from the way you're talking, especially if there was a very strong Nazi influence in the beginning of the organization of the PLO when, say, Yasser Arafat and many of his generals, if you will, were trained and whatever. And it seemed that many of these rebels now were sort of the younger fighters for them, and how are they influenced? I really don't know that much about it, and I was just curious how much you could tell me in a few minutes.
Well, the PLO, yeah, again, in a few minutes, I don't know. The PLO is a very complex organization it's an umbrella organization, and many of its components have links to some to the Soviet bloc, some to the far right. A fellow by the name of George Habash heads up an organization called the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. That has many links to the far right, including CIA. I don't know as the specific current divisions within the PLO or something, because I thought that might have been what you were driving at. I don't know is that something that at least I could comment on with any degree of authoritativeness. A sister station which does cover PLO affairs to some extent is KPFA, which I'm sure you could probably get 94.1. They frequently have interviews with PLO people who could talk about PLO dynamics a little better than I could. But going back to your question about the early connections of the PLO and Palestine nationalism with the Third Reich. The main name you want to know here is somebody we're going to get to in our discussion of the Olympics massacre, is a guy named Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was not only the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem and the chief leader of Palestinian Muslims, but he was as such the spiritual leader of all Palestinian Muslims, but was a major in the SS. Now, one of his proteges was a guy named Hassan Salameh, who took commando training for the Third Reich and was involved in a diversionary organization, diversionary operation, I should say, during the Battle of the Bulge, which was to basically poison the wells of Tel Aviv to start an Arab uprising against the British, thereby diverting British forces away from the planned Nazi offensive in the Ardennes. And his son, Ali Hassan Salameh, was the guy who led the Olympics massacre, and within about a year and a half of leading the Olympics massacre, he was working for the CIA in order to protect American military and diplomatic personnel from attacks by the various Palestinian organizations, which in and of itself is an indication of some of the divisions within that organization. But Haj Amin al-Husseini is the main name you want to know there, and in a Hard Rain broadcast that'll be coming up, hopefully this coming Sunday, if we can get everything on the air, a synopsis of a recent series that's been done on Hard Rain. We'll talk about some of these links, but there's one name you want to know about right off the bat.
Anyway, just one last kind of summing up again to return to the earlier point. One of the problems with the Middle East is that both sides, because again of the fact of British and French dominance in that area, both sides were very actively solicited, and in fact themselves solicited in turn by and to the fascists, if that sentence makes sense. We mentioned about, Begin and Shamir being trained by Mussolini's fascists, about von Bolschwing making contacts with the Haganah. We read many months ago about a Jew who was being smuggled into Palestine, who found himself in the same safe houses with the SS men who were being smuggled out of Europe into South America. So it's a very complex thing to try and pin down, but I hope that this has been at least some help.
Oh, yeah, sure. Great. Okay, well, thanks a lot. If you feel inclined to do a program on it, I would certainly be interested.
Well, we're going to do a Radio Free America in the future to sum up the whole Olympics thing, because that's really a big subject in and of itself. But do stay tuned. We have other programs here on this station that we'll tell you about, and in particular, there's a summary of a recent Hard Rain series, a summary broadcast, which will outline, at the very least, some of these connections for you.
Okay, great. Well, thanks a lot.
Thanks again for your call. Okay, 415-941-2500. We've got a couple of lines open, so don't hesitate to call. And good evening, Berkeley. Welcome to KFJC.
Well, hello. Given Dave's little joke about a phone call and a half ago about Schultz and Weinberger and whatnot, I thought maybe perhaps you could dig up a copy of the Chad Mitchell Trio doing the I Was Not a Nazi polka.
We've got that. I have that at home on a cassette. We'll see if we can do that maybe in another broadcast.
Great. I was wondering if either of you had ever run across a copy of a book entitled The Service, written by Reinhard Gehlen, supposedly his memoirs.
Yeah, I've got a copy of it. It's if it were printed on softer paper, it'd be useful.
Okay, so then it isn't that useful. Okay.
Well, I shouldn't say that. It's useful in the sense that it does give some interesting insights into Gehlen's character. In fact, in talking about Israel, he said he thought it was always too bad that West Germany got itself affiliated with Israel because of the Arab sympathies for Germany, and he didn't say Nazism, but he said Germany, and Nip referred to those sympathies earlier in the broadcast. So it does give some interesting insight into Gehlen's character, and to a certain extent into some of his methodology, but it's also filled with notorious lies, such as that Martin Bormann was a Soviet spy.
Yes, indeed. That was basically my only real question, because I'll tell you the circumstances later on some other time, but it's just sort of was cited as in a bibliography that I had in here for something that I picked up on the street, more or less.
Well, it's always worth looking at, if nothing else, than to be able to look at something like that, no matter how full of self-justifications, etc. It's like reading Richard Nixon's books. It's fascinating, if nothing else, from sort of a psycho-historical point of view, although you might not want to put a lot of credence in anything.
Or putting Kissinger back to back with Seymour Hersh.
Indeed. Wonderful pair.
Okay, I'll make this brief and say goodnight.
Okay, good to hear from you.
Very much for the wonderful job you're doing.
Thanks for the call.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, back to the phones again. 415-941-2500 is the number with the line open. Good evening, San Carlos. Welcome to Radio Free America on KFJC.
I'd like to make a comment and find out what you think about it. It seems that the United States, or certain individuals in the Pentagon and the government and the private sector of the United States and Western nations decided to protect the Nazis for their, their interest as, or they seem to be motivated through greed and lust for power at any cost, whether it's an entire group of people or a planetary biosphere. Do you think that's accurate?
Well, it's awfully difficult to spread that kind of generalization around. I mean, honestly, and I think that this is true, I'm sure that there were some people involved in these activities immediately at the end of World War II who literally were behaving in what they felt were the most, patriotic, commendable possible way, and really felt communism is the worst thing that could happen in the world to the United States, the greatest country in the world, and any means are worth using to defend it. literally any means. And, you know, people who would have gone to their graves convinced that they had never done anything that wasn't in pursuit of the holy grail, you know, of freedom and democracy. So, obviously, some of the people were not like, some of the people were just plain power hungry, as you said, or, you know, just born manipulators or whatever the case may be. But I would hesitate to spread, you know, too thin a generalization on that.
It seems interesting that how could you say, or how could you even conceive that communism would be worse than mass murderers of the heinous type that the Nazis are?
Well, it's like the neutron bomb, you know. The neutron bomb just destroys people. It doesn't kill property, you know. It's a question of where your priorities are. No, I have, honest to goodness, before, well, not before I did One Step Beyond, but when I used to be on another radio station in the morning with another co-host who started here with me at KFJC, this subject came up, and the gentleman involved, Tony Onisco, who I worked with for a long time, is a very honorable, good person, but we had a direct, you know, he was basically saying that same thing. You know, anything is worth stopping communism, and you know, I don't think he quite understood the gravity of what we were talking about, but I mean, still, that impulse is there. So, you know, you have to admit that it's real. You may not agree with it.
That would appear to me to be, you know, quite criminal, and just you sort of destroy the fundamental principles which you're supposed to be supporting, I guess, democracy and the pursuit of freedom, liberty and justice, and I guess more importantly, it would seem to me, obviously, at least to me, that, and I guess there's some other people, that it would usurp the basic principles of life-enhancing, life-supportive, cooperative behavior, and at the possible, or it seems so, at the destruction of humanity and all life on the planet. I mean, that seems where we're going now.
Well, we're certainly headed in that direction. In response to your first question or first comment, caller, there are different people. First of all, there were a lot of people who didn't know about employing these Nazis, and even including those, as we try to indicate, in our own intelligence system, various aspects of U.S. intelligence were reporting the alarming the alarming traveling, the alarming incorporation, the operation of these Nazi war criminals with an impunity seemingly right under the noses of the Americans, reporting this to their superiors at the same time as these reports were filtering up to the very superiors who were in fact operating and pulling the strings of these various agents. So you have varying motivations, certainly both with the major industrialists who had been pro-Nazi during the war and whose connections we talked about in our Uncle Sam and the Swastika broadcast, and with the so-called, you know, small fry fascists who our first caller talked about and that are covered in that book, Undercover. They were pro-Nazi, and certainly there were a few things that they would have enjoyed more than seeing these Nazis brought back to the United States. You know, that fellow John Roy Carlson, or Arthur Darunian as his real name is, he wrote a book, a sequel volume to Undercover called The Plotters, which documented the post-war activities of many of these very same pro-Nazi elements and their functioning with elements abroad. So those are a couple things to think about in that context.
Okay, I just wanted to hear more of a, I guess, sort of a moral conclusion from you guys more often, because it seems like I've got a lot of these tapes. I've got all the tapes, and when I try to tell somebody else, or when somebody else, well, I got all these tapes, and they say, you have 30 hours of tapes. So what? There's all this information. Now, just what does it all mean? It all means that it seems to me that don't protect, I guess, mass murderers and criminals and heinous individuals.
Since you bring it up, caller, since you are looking for some kind of a moral conclusion, by and large, obviously, we try and avoid getting too personal, and although we wouldn't do it if we weren't personally involved. I mean, obviously, if it didn't mean something to us, we wouldn't be doing it in the first place.
Yeah.
But to address the issue very briefly, and I think probably the simplest form possible that you can kind of slap on as a fairly consistent moral throughout the whole thing, I think the point of what we're doing, briefly, is that before, okay, because the whole thing of anti-Americanism on, that's slapped on this kind of work and this kind of journalism just falls out the window. The point of what we're doing is Americanism. What we're saying is that before the United States can become the kind of country that it wants to think that it is, we had better realize that at many times, in many places, and currently, right now, we are often the bad guy, not the good guy. And until we do that, and until we give up this incredible blindness about these things as a culture, we're doomed. We are writing our own epitaph, and I think that's basically the moral that underlies the whole thing.
I think, caller, it could be summed up could be summed up by a neat little phrase that was turned by John Donne, the British English poet, several hundred years ago, when he said, "He who would lie with the dogs must rise with the fleas." Along those lines, the different elements of fascism have different motives. They're all anti-communist. My experience from my studies of the Third Reich is that for German National Socialism, for Nazism, anti-communism is as much of a means as it is an end. They are certainly anti-communist and devoted to eradicating communism or socialism in all of its forms. But anti-communism for them is also a very important MO, a modus operandi, through which they are able to infiltrate many organizations by representing them themselves, and very accurately so, as anti-communists, because the German Nazis themselves stemmed from a pan-German occult group called the Secret Order of Tula, which retained very strong influence, particularly upon the SS, and they believed that the Germans were a master race destined to rule the world. So when you invite these people in, when you lie with the dogs, you rise with the fleas, and I think that's one of the reasons why we're finding ourselves scratching so much today.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for your call.
Okay,
bye-bye. All right, back to the phone, to the line open at 415-941-2500. Good evening, Palo Alto. Welcome to KFJC and Radio Free America.
Hello.
Hello.
I just have one little tidbit of information, then two questions. One of them is getting back to Elmer Bobst, someone who I have a particular interest in. His first wife's name was Ethel Rose from the steel conglomerate in Pittsburgh. She later she is directly related to the Mudge Rose and Nixon law firm, which Nixon originally got started in. Just a little bit of trivia there.
That's quite interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Another thing, I have a question. I'm very interested in Klaus von Bülow. Does he fit into any of this? Has he any kind of a connection?
It's that old Prussian von, right?
Yeah, well,
Changing of the names and all this stuff.
His father was a documented Nazi in Sweden, I believe it was, and his affiliations, I've forgotten the father's name, his Nazi affiliations are well known. Von Bülow himself was an interesting fellow. Three of his jurors were from the, I've forgotten what the name is, something like the School of Naval and I've forgotten its exact name, but a very prominent naval intelligence institution from Providence, Rhode Island, which is interesting when you're getting a random selection of jurors. His defense attorney is the same defense attorney that Edwin Wilson had, a guy named Harold Price Faringer. So it's interesting, and there was a von Bülow family very, very closely affiliated with the Krupp industrial empire in Germany, and its affiliations with German conquest, both during World War II and before that, are very well known.
Well, didn't he change his name? Wasn't it something like Annenberg or something like that previously?
I don't remember. He may have changed his name. The father's name was not von Bülow, at least as far as we know. I've forgotten what his name was, but he was a Nazi. He was pro-Nazi, and I've forgotten what kind of an end he met. But
because he changed his name to von Bülow, he named his daughter Cosima, which is Cosima von Bülow was the name of the wife of Richard Wagner. Kind of an interesting choice.
That's right. That's true. That is correct. Back on the subject also, the earlier question about Nixon's law firm. Now, Dave, I'm going to have to get you at least a nod or a head shake from you on this. Was this that, now, the law firm was, what was the name caller at that time?
Rose and Nixon.
Okay. Now, was that at the same law firm that was later used as the Western Tube Front?
No, that was Bewley, Krupp and Nixon.
That's what I thought, okay.
This was one that he was affiliated with. Interestingly enough, though, that law firm did a lot of legal work for the Sindona Empire.
Right,
McKaylee Sindona.
It's just interesting that Nixon, one of his law firms, then being the instrument to introduce Nikolai Malaksa, a prominent Iron Guard financier, into the country, and another law institute being, at least in some way, shape, or form, however distantly, connected to Elmer Bobst, an intimate, apparently, of Otto von Bolschwing. So.
Well, I know that Warner Lambert did extensive dealings with the Nazis during World War II, and also World War I was apparently where they claimed to have made most of the fortune, so it's some ongoing thing.
Right.
And I have one other question, something that's beginning to interest me more and more.
Later, before we get to that caller, note that all of the pharmaceutical industries worldwide have a very close traditional association with the IG Farben Nazi conglomerate, so that's something to keep in mind, too.
Oh, another little bit of gossip here. Elmer Bobst's son, named Walton, tried to start his own pharmaceutical company in Switzerland during the 1950s, and it is reputed that he was assassinated by his father. But I don't have any documented information on that. This is all hearsay. But
the blood is thicker than the water, obviously.
Yeah, well, remember what John Donne said, you know.
That's right.
My question is that I know from my readings of history, now they maybe have been tainted or whatever, but there was a big grab bag of Nazis at the end of World War II. The Russians also tried to get their share of whatever the was up for the grabs. What do you know about Nazis who later became prominent within the Soviet Union after supposedly putting on different uniforms also? This has to do with the idea of possibly a sort of a Odessa conspiracy or something to get the two world powers into a cataclysmic war in which they would both be obliterated, and then the Fourth Reich could reassert itself.
You should have heard the conversation we had before the radio show tonight, because it deals very much with this kind of stuff.
We were talking about some of the Byzantine connections. Yeah, two good books to look for, caller. Again, the Skorzeny, subtitled Hitler's Commando by Glenn Infield, talks at some length about ODESSA and SS contingents that were working, at least to all appearances, for the Soviets. Another book, also by Glenn Infield. As a matter of fact, there's a paperback at it. The Skorzeny book is kind of hard to find, but you look around, be resourceful, and you can check it out. And like I said, we're going to give you an address at the end of the broadcast where we'll talk about that. Maybe you can find that book. But there's another book by Glenn Infield called Secrets of the SS, and there's a recent paperback edition which some people have seen around in stores. And that talks about also some SS men who went to work for the Soviet intelligence system. Specifically, there's a reference there to something called the SSD, the Staatssicherheitsdienst, which was an SS contingent put together by Soviet bloc intelligence, specifically East German intelligence, for the purpose of infiltrating the SS, the huge SS contingent within the Gehlen organization. And they, among other things, were successful in spiriting out all of the documents of the Wannsee Institute, which, among other things, was in charge of all Sicherheitsdienst intelligence against SS intelligence against Russia, and that was headed up by Akhmatelli and Augsburg of Green Berets that we talked about before. Infield in Skorzeny, Hitler's Commando, talks at some length about SS men being used by the Soviet system and about these really sort of Byzantine counter-espionage conspiracies. Exactly, which SS guys working for which side and where their real allegiances lie is a subject of real hot debate. There's a tremendously incestuous relationship. Gehlen's chief of counterintelligence for a long time was a guy named Heinz Felfer, and he turned out to be KGB eventually. And but when I was guesting for Nip Tuck on One Step Beyond last Sunday, I said, and I can't speak for Nip here, I'll get his comment, I guess, in a sec. I don't deal, at least on air, that much with counter-espionage. In other words, KGB head-to-head with CIA or other opposing intelligence services, because really, about the only thing you know for sure is that you're not going to get the truth from either side. There is some historical documentation for SS men working for the Russians. Plus, you recall in Radio Free America, all of the Third Reich police apparatus was part of the RSHA, the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, and you had the RSHA basically consisted of the SD, the SS intelligence service, plus something called the SIPO, which not only involved the Gestapo, but also the Kriminalpolizei as well. So any German post-World War II German with real police experience would have been nominally at least a member of the SS, and so certainly given the relatively sparse population and the extent to which all of the Eastern countries were hard put to come up with requisite people to serve in their various institutions, I'd be willing to bet, and there's considerable evidence that there are a fair number of Nazi police veterans working in various police capacities in East Germany.
As I understand it, I think that the space program also in both countries borrowed heavily from sort of a split down the middle of kind of rivalries within the German rocket program. Am I correct on that, or do you know anything about that?
Yeah. Good book to check that out is Project Paperclip by Clarence Lasby. Talks about that at some length. Athenium Press is publishers. So see if you can dig that one up. That talks about that at some length. Yeah, there was hot competition to grab as many of the experts as they could.
I would, of course, applying to nuclear weapons.
I would suggest very briefly, just 2 quick points, caller. One, on the subject of the rocket scientists, I would say that if in any cases that there was a case where some people honestly did not go to one side or the other because of political preferences, it would have been among the rocketry experts, although certainly a lot of the rocketry experts were very profoundly pro-Nazi, and von Braun and Dornberger's background is talked about at some length in Operation Paperclip, Project Paperclip. But I would say also there's probably a possibility that some of the scientists merely just went with whoever wound up with them without any particular ideological thing. On the other end, in answer to your first question, I generally agree with Dave on the subject of SS and counterintelligence and KGB, etc. The only thing I would suggest is that in the march on Berlin, I would say that fewer of the German SS people and people of that nature would have gone over to the Russians, as opposed to, say, if the Russians had gone into Italy, it probably would have been split about 50-50 as to what side people wound up on. Whereas the Germans, and specifically the SS, had such a profound hatred of Bolshevism and of the communist system that I think that a lot of them probably would just not have done it for what, however they would have gotten out of it. They just would not have gone and would not have been able to fit into that system, because we're talking about a real indoctrination, to the point of blood ritual and things like that.
Sure, but what interests me is the possibility of a collusion, of a deliberate infiltration of the Soviet Union with long-term goals in mind.
Everything is possible in the world of counterintelligence.
Both, the Soviet intelligence system has, been pretty heavily penetrated by Gehlen agents of all stripe, Eastern European solidarists and so forth. And in turn, they've been very successful in penetrating Gehlen. So,
who knows?
Again, it's a very Byzantine connection, and you really don't know. All we can do is speculate, and one of the things we try to do with our hard documentary format is to try and stick to what we can really, document. There is massive infiltration by both Gehlen into KGB, Soviet, Warsaw Pact intelligence, and vice versa. Exactly, who's controlling whom? I think probably both sides would really like to know,
Indeed.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks again for the call.
Goodbye.
I might mention, too, real quickly, that one of the things Dave and I were talking about before the show started tonight is that when we do get to the Radio Free Americas we're going to do on the assassination of the Pope, we're going to be talking, among other things, about the Bulgarian connections and things of that nature, which deal exactly with this kind of stuff that the caller has been talking about. However, we're going to, again, try and limit it to pretty much stuff that we can document at that point. Anyway, going back to the phones with a line open at 415-941-2500. Good evening, San Jose. Thanks for waiting. Welcome to Radio Free America.
Yes, good evening. I had a couple of questions and some comments. I really enjoyed your show.
Thank you.
It's not over yet. Stay tuned.
Yeah, and I continue to. The first one is you brought up some points about the CIA and the ODESSA network basically establishing the Egyptian Secret Service and being influential in establishing the PLO.
The first Palestinian terrorists, I don't know if we can equate that with the PLO, which is a political organization.
That was my mistake. I stuck those two terms together in summing something up, and one should not necessarily do that.
Okay, well, in any event, having a great influence establishing the Egyptian Secret Service, ostensibly to work against the interest of Israel and the State of Israel.
Right.
And then on the other hand, how do you... if you have a contradiction, which I see here, because you have the CIA also establishing and financing and arming the Zionist fascist state of Israel on the on one side, and then you have the Egyptian Secret Service on the other, and you also mentioned Syria. I was in and out, so I didn't catch it all. But you didn't really seem to deal with that contradiction. Why would the U.S. or the imperialist powers of the West go about financing these opposing forces like that?
Okay, first of all, a couple of questions. First of all, I just want to take a slight bit of exception with the term Zionist fascist government of Israel, especially, the early days is hard to tell because I was coming out of the revolutionary ferment of the post-war era in the Middle East. But certainly in much of the later part of the Israeli government, I wouldn't use that term. I come close to that term with the Begin government and parts of the Shamir government, but it's just a term I'm a little uncomfortable with. To address your point specifically, well, one of the reasons, as was mentioned in the article from the Cookridge book, rather, that one of the reasons that they sent the Nazis to to Egypt to set up the Secret Service was precisely because of the CIA's direct contacts with Israel. Now, why they would allow them to do it is because primarily they were not supporting Egypt to attack Israel. Soviet influence, and the fact that the Nazis were only too happy to help a country that had bitter quarrels with Israel was sort of more in the nature of a bonus for the Nazis, I think. Hello?
Hello?
Okay. Yeah, I think that question really probably could be, studied a little more, and will in the future. I have my own sort of suspicion in some studies I've done. I really feel that the main imperialist powers of the West are one thing they do. At least this is the way it seems to end up. Is they seem to set up opposing states, smaller opposing states in one area of the world, and have them oppose each other. And at the same time, by them opposing each other, gain and the upper hand, over the overall situation.
Oh, certainly. Well, I think that both the Eastern and Western blocs specialize in that. I mean, that's how. In reality, that's one of the reasons why both the East and the West and the Soviet Union and the United States really have more in common than they have in opposition. They both really do maintain their control over their relative spheres just by that very self-same kind of activity.
Well, I don't think you could necessarily generalize. They're certainly, I think you could say both might operate in that. Both have operated, but I think it's dangerous to make worldwide generalizations. I would, counsel, with a soft touch, both of you, to avoid generalizing totally about, imperialist powers doing this or that. I think
point well taken.
Focusing specifically on Israel and the Arab nations. I think in that context, I think to a certain extent, your comment is well taken. One of the, and I would term the present Israeli government fascist with a capital F. The Begin, the Beitarim, the so-called revisionist Zionists, were closely affiliated with Mussolini in both spirit and body.
Right.
And but the Shamir government was even to the right of that. They were it's Yitzhak Shamir, who of course was Begin's foreign minister, was affiliated with something called the Stern Gang, which advocated an open military alliance between Hitler and the Jews. And so I would call the present government of Israel fascist with a capital F, both in philosophy and in practice.
I have no objections to that. I was objecting to the 30 years of governmental history in Israel being so characterized.
I think Zionism, this is actually what Nip just did was to anticipate what I was saying. Zionism as an institution has metamorphosed in a fascistic direction, I think largely because of the ongoing conflict with the Arab nations that you talked about. And I think one of the things that that conflict has done, and perhaps one thing to think about, caller, in terms of if you want to think about fascism in a world sense, is that one of the very noteworthy outgrowths of the increasing militarism and I would say current fascist stance of Israel is the right-wing swing, and it's fairly dramatic and well documented, of a large portion of the American Jewish population, and they wield a very significant influence. I'm not talking now about the Zionist conspiracy or something like that, but they have traditionally provided a very strong element of the American liberal political spectrum, and with the sort of cementing of world Jewish sentiments to Zionism or along Zionist lines, and with the rightward swing of Israel, it has promoted a rightward swing of American Jewry on the whole, and in particular you see the American Jewish community flock to Richard Nixon in 1972, and also there are is, I should say, a lot of discussion now about Jews supporting Reagan, because of his close support of Israel, and also because of aversion to, Jesse Jackson's sentiments in Arabs and so
action,
forth.
yeah.
So that's something to think about too. Is that the rightward swing of Israel, in addition to providing.
Okay, I think we're back on.
KFJC Los Altos Hills.
Thank you.
Okay.
You're still with us, caller, huh?
Okay, I did have one other quick comment. I just read a book called Are We All Nazis?
It's a great title. Sounds like a band. Go ahead.
I saw the title at the library. I said, my God, what is this? And it's by a man by the name of Hans Askenasy, Askenasy. It's very interesting. He deals with the psychology of mass lunacy, and he uses a lot of analysis with World War II and comments on how 200 million people went to their death, over essentially a mad, he called it a collective madness. Hello?
Yeah, we're listening.
He doesn't really get down, in other words, he doesn't arrive at any clear conclusions about why. He just says it's a certain kind of environment that causes people to allow themselves to, kill each other and so on, and he sees it happening today for the same reason. I would argue against that and say that there are real reasons that it's based on a profit system and so forth, profits before people and so on. But it is a good book, and I would recommend it for people if they have a, like the last caller mentioned, moral questions and so forth.
Right.
And it also brings up another point. In San Jose, there was and I have to draw this in because you mentioned Lauterbach and the Hitler Youth Corps.
Right.
And I wish you would go into that maybe a little further. There was a recent happening during a graduation of valedictorian Lizette España, who happens to be from San Salvador. Her parents do, in the event, was denied the right to give her valedictorian speech. The people, Rodriguez and Cross are their names, principal and vice principal, said that it would be damaging and degrading to the people. Apparently she had some critical remarks to make about the administration and about some of the teachers, and it's generally a fairly moderate criticism, but they wouldn't allow her to make that speech, and it just brought to mind the problem with mind control, and the problem with how schools and the whole system of ideas are controlled by things like the school system and newspapers and TV and so forth, and that's essentially what happened in Germany, and the Nazis were the greatest masters of all time in doing that. But it's happening also today in this country and throughout the world. So if maybe you could do a little more on things like how Hitler controlled
the Hitler Jugend and all that.
A great mass of people. The German people essentially didn't hate the Americans. Studies have been done on that. The average German didn't have anything against them. In fact, the higher-ranking Nazis had nothing against Americans or British as such. But there they went. And now the communists are a whole different matter. Hate against communism is like
mother's milk.
Just liking the devil. You just do it.
Well, again, I would say that for the Nazis at least, anti-communism was more an MO. In other words, they got much of the critical industrial support that they needed from Britain and the United States by representing themselves, again, accurately as anti-communists, and they also, after the war, were able to worm their way to an even greater extent into the bosom of both, at least the United States and NATO. they had in mind world conquest, the Nazis at least. In other words, and I think today, I think the Nazi contingent within our intelligence system plans to conquer, I think they have in mind nothing short of the total subjugation not only of the American people, the so-called average working American, but eventually I think they plan to put the Rockefellers and everybody else out of business as well. They plan to conquer the world. I don't think that was as much a case with, the Mussolini certainly planned empire, but I think that was more of a pure fascist government in the sense of pure anti-communism. Anti-communism, this is a personal opinion from my own studies, but that anti-communism for the Nazis was more a means to the end of world conquest, which lay at the very core of the pan-German occultists, which gave rise to that movement as a spiritual, philosophical movement. You've raised a mouthful. I mean, I just gave you a mouthful back, but the issues you raised are, I think, far too broad for us to discuss in the context here, particularly generalizing from Hitler's Germany to the recent goings-on at San Jose High. As far as, Hitler being, the whole phenomenon of Nazism being ascribable to lunacy, well, all I can say is Hitler was the first low nut, but the whole issue of mind control, both individual and collective, is something we've dealt with in the past on the KFJC triumvirate, I guess you could say, one step beyond May, Brussels, and Hard Rain, and we will continue to do that in the future.
Yeah. I'd better put an end to this myself, caller, because if I started to respond to the stuff that you and Dave said, we would indeed be going around on this all night. And it's certainly a subject worthy of further conversation, and the history of this kind of propaganda activity is worth following up on, too, and that will be obviously coming up from time to time.
I don't know if you, I don't want to sound like I didn't make my point. The only thing I had to comment with San Jose is, mind control is just going on.
Oh, yeah. Well, there's mind control is overt and covert, and I think your point is well made. It doesn't necessarily have to mean you're strapped down in a chair and needles are driven into your forehead. It can be a lot more subtle and a lot more automatic than that, a lot more a process of, sociological conditioning. No, I think your point was well made.
Okay, keep up the good work.
Thanks for your call. Have a good night.
Bye.
Okay, we've got some lines open. We had them all full, and then they dropped off again. So they're out there, though. 415-941-2500. We do have a couple of lines open. The big casino, folks. So if you want to get on, this is your chance. Give us a buzz. Let us know what's on your mind. Once again, 415-941-2500. And good evening, Sunnyvale. Welcome to Radio Free America.
Hello, guys. Do you take requests? It's the Field Marshal.
Yeah, right. The greatest hits.
What
right
would
here.
you like to hear?
We'll make sure you listen to it for a long time.
Something like Oops Up stuff or something like that, yeah. I was wondering, what might be an interesting adjunct to this particular discussion is our supposed Nazi hunters. Now, Mae Russell, I've heard on a summer broadcast that she mentions supposed quote-unquote frauds like Simon Wiesenthal, who are, and she hasn't yet elaborated on it, or I might have missed a tape on it, and it might be very interesting to maybe discuss some of the Nazi infiltration into such groups that are supposedly in favor or go around trying to apprehend fugitive Nazis. It's like bogus organizations. So I do have an article buried somewhere in my newspaper where supposed ex-member of the Nazi Party, I should have dug it up, evidently joined one of these particular groups. I can't remember which. It might be the Jewish Defense League, but it might be an interesting subject to follow up on.
Well, I'm sure there's infiltration now. I don't know what May's referring to. I'm going to let Dave talk about it in a second, but I would, again, be very hesitant to start throwing the term bogus. I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
I'm just saying I would be very hesitant once again because, again, in a larger sense, as we've been talking about, the one of the main things that defeats certain types of efforts is, and one of the reasons that, for instance, that the left, not being pro-left myself necessarily, one of the reasons the left has never been a political force to reckon with in the United States or almost anywhere, really, is because there's so much factionalism, and there's so much like, well, you're a Stalinist, well, you're a Trotskyist, and one has to be very careful sowing those seeds among anti-fascism, although certainly vigilance is important, right? Right. Okay. Dave, do you have anything to say to that?
Well, a couple things. As far as May's specific discussion of Wiesenthal, I'll give you one interesting thing about what May has experienced with Wiesenthal, and another interesting piece of research. Charles Hyam, who wrote a book about Errol Flynn. He was a Hollywood writer. He was not originally a political writer. He wrote a book about Errol Flynn, originally just to be a straight Flynn bio, as he had with other big-name Hollywood stars, and he came across Flynn's Gestapo connections. While in Germany, researching those Nazi connections of Errol Flynn, he stopped by Wiesenthal's to ask him about a particular Nazi war criminal or a Nazi that he was tracing down, and Wiesenthal put him off of the guy's trail, and he said basically said that the guy wasn't anywhere to be seen. In fact, the guy was right there in town, and a lot of May's suspicion stems, because May has been in touch with Chaim, stems from that. Partially the fact that Wiesenthal, also I think it is speaking for May here in this case, I think that the fact that Wiesenthal has not shown much appetite for chasing down, in other words, if you're looking for Nazi war criminals, we showed you where a few of them could be found just from documented literature earlier in the broadcast. One of the Nazi war criminals who is supposedly very much being sought today is a fellow named Alois Brunner. Okay, now we talked about how he was working for BND in Damascus as of 1957. His trail has become more elusive. Apparently he was spotted in Damascus in 1982. But I think that is also has a lot to do with May's suspicions. In other words, if the guy's looking for Nazis, you know, he could pick up a book and find an awful lot of them, and find out that in fact they are very much with us today. I mean, the murderers among us. Wiesenthal's book talks about that a little bit, but also Ted Rubenstein, who does a lot of research for us, has come across something very interesting as well, which is that a lot of people who have contributed to Wiesenthal's organization in this country are in fact some big-name Jewish mobsters. Alan Dorfman comes to mind, the late Alan Dorfman, and I think also the late Meyer Lansky. I'd have to check the names. I'll try and do that for you, but that has a lot to do with it, I think. And you know, I think the fellow you were talking about was a guy named Mike Connolly, who initially was a Nazi and then went to work for the Jewish Defense League. I don't think he was an infiltrator as such with JDL. I think he's actually, at this point, is pretty close to Irv Rubin, who's head of the Los Angeles Jewish Defense League. I don't think Irv Rubin shows much appetite for chasing down the Gehlen gang. You know, maybe it's one thing to go out and chase a few Klansmen or street Nazis, but you know, when the JDL and Wiesenthal start dealing with Josef Mengele's American citizenship circa 1932, then I guess maybe we can view them as being serious.
Well, there's a precedent, don't forget, Menachem Begin, even the warning article back in 1948 written by Albert Einstein, if I've got my information correct, warning about Mr. Menachem Begin. Right now he's being swallowed whole as, supposed Jewish leader and staunch guardian of the Jewish state. Well, if you look back from the KFJC research, you'll find that's quite the contrary. So there is a precedent for this type of thing if this does occur. And, it's not something I just brought out because it's on top of my head. I just think there might be some validity behind it.
That's true.
It makes sense, though. I mean, if you're going to get a huge organization going and you want to get some agents provocateurs and maybe poison the point of view, it helps your cause to put up an organization that is, bogus in a sense and make the whole cause of anti-Nazism look really bad. So like COINTELPRO,
Right.
So, and I also wanted to mention, there's Russian influence in, let's say, a country like Hungary, where there still might be Austro-Hungarian influences in Hungary, as far as family ties are concerned, that might stave off, any serious commitment to the Communist Party line. It's someone mentioned, as was mentioned earlier on the program, that there's a possibility that maybe the Soviets might have drawn in some ex-SS men. You also got to, realize that some of the countries that are so-called Soviet satellite are really a lot more Western than we care to think about. Bulgaria with its drug connections near Turkey and everything, and a few other things like that. And Romania's attempt to join the Olympics this year, so we might have a sort of a tilted view of how powerful the Soviets actually are in conjunction with their satellite countries.
It is dangerous to generalize. Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, and Finland fought with the Axis during World War II. Certainly, I think you can expect to be some residual fascist elements in all of those countries. I mean, political sentiments don't just evaporate, with battlefield defeat. That's something to keep in mind. Something for you to look into there, Field Marshal. Again, we'll give you the research information, or Tom Davis Books information later in the broadcast. But the book that we read about the Gaddafi, Gehlen, Skorzeny connection, Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, discusses the fact that the post-war Bormann financial network, largely through the very large Argentinian Jewish population, which, if memory serves me correctly, is the world's 6th largest, has been, in fact, a very generous supporter of Israel, and that, in fact, Jews have actually been incorporated into the Bormann financial organization, and that this Bormann support through the Argentinian Jewish community of Zionism in Israel has been one of the reasons why there has not been more vigorous pursuit of Nazi war criminals by Israel. But that's, again, Paul Manning, Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, and we'll give you information about where to get that at the end of the broadcast.
Yeah, a couple of 2 quick points, concluding points. It's very important to make sure that every point that is made in the past Nazi connections, American affiliation with Nazi business, is brought up to the present, because a lot of people have sort of a sense like this is in past, it's buried, it no longer exists. It's very important to hint on it. Hey, it's still present, it's still there. You've got, take past events and make a connection there and make sure people remember it, because people sometimes, I think my personal opinion is that Americans are notorious for forgetting history. And it's very important to bring up this very sordid detail of our particular political past and keep hammering it as far as the present is concerned. And, make people aware, hey, it's not dead, it's alive and well, and if anything, it's getting worse. And second point, believe me, this is going to sound like a really corny statement, but actually Nazism begins at home. Anytime you have a high rate of domestic violence or anything like that, you sort of seed the area for things like Nazism, which actually feeds on absolute discontent. And that's something I think people should think about. Nazism just didn't come out of thin air. It began somewhere in someone's head and was later passed on. And people sort of remember that, what can I do to combat, things like fascism and stuff, so make sure that you don't have an environment that actually breeds it. Let's say you have, stagnant water, it's going to breed mosquitoes.
Right, well,
if you have a particular area or neighborhood that's particularly tense and people dislike each other, you've already got the seeds basically there for things like fascism.
Well, apropos of your 2 points, real quickly, just to kind of paraphrase what you were just saying just last, stereotyping and scapegoatism is the seedbed for fascism, basically. Is when you can start taking a group of people, saying they're all the same, and then blaming things on them. You have got a fine basis. What you said first about not forgetting brought to mind something I noticed earlier when I was rereading this Otto von Bolschwing article. They talk about von Bolschwing when he was being interviewed for this job at Trans International Computer Investment Corp, TCI, and they asked him about blah 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 about his time in the Gestapo prison, where he was not mentioning his Nazi ties, of course, and he says something to the effect of, oh yeah, here it is, quote, "That was not a good experience. One should forget it because it only is a negative approach to life to think about bad things." Well, what that reminded me of very strongly, as you probably remember, when we talked about Otto Ambros, one of the only civilians ever convicted of war crimes, who was brought into this country by J. Peter Grace to help out with some of his business concerns. And Otto Ambros, when asked about the involvement of I.G. Farben in slave labor at Auschwitz and things like that, said something to the effect of, well, it was a long time ago. It concerned Jews. You Americans think about these things too much, right? Some very sort of similar comments on people who'd rather that you didn't, in fact, think too much about these kinds of things.
Perhaps because, as George Santayana, the Spanish philosopher, said, very well-known phrase, those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. And two quick points, Field Marshal, or actually good to everybody, really. You may want to grab hold of that von Bolschwing article for yourselves, because it was...
yeah, I've read it. It's just available in my public library. And I think Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, might also be available in my local public library. I have to check it.
Well, so check it out, but the point is the San Jose Mercury is definitely available to everybody's local library. That was November 20th, 1981, and you should grab a hold of that. Also, become a little more conspicuous than you all have been on phone-in talk shows on other stations. If you want to, it's a tremendous vehicle for communicating information. If you want to get the word out, that's sure as heck the way to do it.
Yeah, well, hopefully KFJC's listenership will sort of boost up, because it's a real nerve-wrack hanging on the end of the station, and this is something I feel very emotional about. I'm just afraid if I get on some unfriendly grounds or there's red baiting or something, I might go, wah, lose my cool and make a real... but there are a lot of programs about psychology and stuff you'll never get on.
Take a bullet.
Subject. So it's really, really tough. That's why programs like this is so important, is to pass the word about programs like this and bypass the rum cakes on the other stations, because they change their format.
Well, I don't know. Now, let me give you a specific example. Now, on KPFA, on William Mandel's program last Monday, I should say, they were talking about the Olympics and the Soviet boycott of the Olympics, and they were talking about it in terms of Soviet dissatisfaction with American policy. I was interested to listen, because I know there's a reasonably large intersection between our audience and KPFA. We undoubtedly have a fair number of people who do listen to KPFA, to see if anybody called in about the Western Goals LAPD scam that we've talked about so much. not a word was heard, and that kind of sitzkrieg, shall we say, is the kind of thing that's going to get you all made into soap. So you may want. I got a knock on that last one. Certainly listen to KFJC and get your information here. But you'd be surprised how much you can get out on other stations if you put your.
I'm not telling people just not to call on station. I'm saying it's not going to be an easy road, and that's why maybe I don't. I'm not always on top of it, calling in, because the format on AM stations is very much psychology, what's your problem, this and that, much so than it was in the past,
Sure. Well, you have to pick your spots. This is, wait until there's a show that has something specific, like, say, one of the ones on KGO, where, Easton or somebody's talking about some specific thing.
Certainly terrorism gets talked about an awful lot, and,
the bogey.
Here was an opportunity for those people who've been talking, again, referring back to the Mandel program, for people who've been listening here to edify some of the KPFA listeners. But apparently, people out there would rather complain about how KPFA doesn't cover this stuff, and yet when they have a chance to inform some of the people at KPFA about it, as I say, sitzkrieg.
Yeah, well, any little bit helps. I just decided to bring up that point for anyone who thinks it's, really easy.
I hope you don't feel like that's been hung on you.
No, we're not talking about you specifically.
No, I'm aware of the situations, and I think people like KGO and stuff I'm just a guess that they might have this stuff in mind, because the public, I think, is becoming a little more aware, especially when there's a lot of detail in the press about terrorism and stuff, that they might get a few people gone that it might blow the whole thing apart. But it's definitely, and... if you listen to Mae Russell and all the so-called assassination she hints on, Jessica Savage and everything, I think the news media is going to get very, very shaky, especially since it's coming close to election. They're going to start clamming up about this stuff, and you won't see too many opportunities on the major stations to come in and just bring it forth. But I'm saying if the opportunity's there, it's fine. I'm trying to discourage anyone, so give them a warning.
Right. Well, that's all the better reason. If you make noise now, then the absence of noise later on will be all the more
notable. I choose this avenue as a place to make my noise. So, that's basically my home ground. So this is sort of an answer to Dave. This is why not, really hitting on some of the other stations. It's probably that's why.
I'm not talking to you as an individual. This is not a personal condemnation. I'm just saying that to all of the people who are out there, this is certainly the claim that there's nothing you can do is nothing but, as far as I'm concerned, justifying inaction. Remember, borrowing a phrase from Smokey the Bear, only you can prevent fascism.
I'm going to put a small cap on this one now, since we are coming up to the top of the hour. Field Marshal, good to hear from you.
Okay, take it easy. Keep up the good fight, and I'll do whatever I can, however little that is.
We know you're out there pitching, guy.
Okay, take it easy.
Take it easy, Dave, okay? You take care. Bye-bye. All right, and just want to mention here, we got another hour to go. We are going to be taking one more time to you that coming up in July 8th and 15th, July 8th from Fickle Stuff. I might mention that... we mentioned a couple times during the show that a lot of the books that people have mentioned that are very difficult to find, there is a place that you can find them. And right now, and again, we always stress this, we have no commercial involvement with these people whatsoever. It just happens to be, as far as most of us know, the only source for a lot of this material. We're referring to Tom Davis books, formerly Research, formerly Ares Research. And you can write to Tom Davis for a book list on these very self-same subjects. You can write to him at Tom Davis Books, P.O. Box 1107, Aptos, California, APTOS, 95001-1107. It's one of those tricksy business zip codes. So Tom Davis Books, P.O. Box 1107, Aptos, California, 95001-1107. Okay, now, once again, 415-941-2500. We do have lines open, and Dave...
I'm going to read the bibliography. We have no calls, so if you want to get through, now's your time. 415-941-2500. Do not delay. Basically, running down a bibliography of the shows, of the books, rather, used on the show. We started... Basically, the first book was The Yankee and Cowboy War by Carl Oglesby, softcover. Berkeley Medallion Books, copyrighted 1976. There we go. One line's lit up. We still have two open lines. A book called Gehlen, Spy of the Century by E.H. Cookridge, hardcover edition, Random House, 1971. Also a paperback edition, Pyramid Books, 1973, is also available in that. A book called Skorzeny, subtitled Hitler's Commando, that by Glenn Infield, copyrighted 1981, hardcover edition, St. Martin's Press. A book called Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, by Paul Manning. That is copyrighted 1981. Lyle Stewart Press is the publisher. a book called The Bormann Brotherhood, that authored by William Stevenson, S-T-E-V, not P-H. Softcover edition, Bantam Books, copyright 74. Hardcover edition is also available in that by Harcourt Brace Jovanovich. I believe the copyright date was 73, if memory serves on that. And that pretty much takes care of the books that we've used on this program. Now, as far as newspaper articles, first of all, the Otto von Bolschwing article from the San Jose Mercury News, November 20th, 1981. An article basically about, I should say, Helena von Dahm, that from the Chronicle, August 3rd of 1982. And also an article, a section of an article from Gung Ho magazine. Gung Ho's issue of May 1982. The article was The CIA's Man for All Nations. That by a man named William Seymour, S-E-Y-M-O-U-R. Okay, and that give you the information about Helmut Streicher. So those are the sources for the broadcast this evening. And also an allusion to two newspaper articles from the New York Times, I believe March 8th, 1982, and also March 19th of 1982. Those about Hans Langemann. Now, you can check the New York Times guide on that for the exact dates. Look up Langemann, and they should have that. And also a brief reference also to a book called O Vatican by Paul Hoffman, which had Hans Langemann's work infiltrating a BND spy ring into the Vatican. So that give you a lead on where to find some of this information if you'd like to check it out for yourselves.
Indeed. We're documentary heavy here, folks. We got so much documentation, we're giving it away. Okay, we do still have a line or two open, 415-941-2500. Now we're in the middle of a full-bore stall until we get the information as to who's on the line to us, and hopefully that will be coming in real quick and we can go to the phones. If not, I'm just going to jump right in. Yes.
While we're doing the full-bore stall also, one last thing. Radio Free Europe, Jack Anderson column from the San Francisco Chronicle, February 20th of 1982. And that Chronicle column was entitled Radio Free Europe in Hot Water. Okay, so that'll give you the last of the sources there for the broadcast this evening, for those of you who may not have gotten it. Okay, and do, tape the broadcast. It's a very good way of preserving the information. You can go back and, go over it, take notes, transcribe whole portions of it if you'd like to, and blow people away, hopefully.
Okay, well, now, I'm glad we got done with this before we had to start humming and whistling. Anyway, we're going to the phones, 415-941-2500. When we hang up, a line is open. Good evening, Palo Alto, and welcome to KFJC.
Hey, good evening to you. Happy Solstice Day.
Happy Solstice.
Yeah, interesting topic on your show tonight. I hate to drop to the bottom line right away, but I was taping May Brussels' show today and was interested at the correlation of data banks that's going on down Texas way. I wonder if you could help me out on connecting the transplant of the CIA structure and information network, selective bombing and whatnot, to this continent, to the correlation of data banks that they're doing now.
Well, the reference, you're talking about the May Brussels tape last night?
That was this afternoon, I think.
Well, it was hard rain this afternoon. It was May Brussels last night.
Okay, yeah, it was her offering the new caveats about the big computers in Texas.
Yeah, there's a huge computer center. I've forgotten the name of the organization, but it's down in Austin, and it's going to be its head. I believe it's a corporation which has basically been it's closely affiliated with the federal government, and it's sort of a cooperative effort among a number of large data processing and computer companies. Its head is Bobby Inman, formerly, I believe, Deputy Director of the CIA, and very closely affiliated with Task Force 157, which is a naval intelligence CIA operation headed by Henry Kissinger, according to Penny Lernoux, and in her book In Banks We Trust, and notably with one of the main operatives in Task Force 157, the aforementioned Edwin Wilson. Okay, and of course, data banks are something. I'm not a computer whiz, and so I can't really speak in an authoritative sense or in a hardcore technical sense. But it is very, very possible to access computers, and if you have computer information in one place, of course, it can be tied in with a computer operation somewhere else. one of the things to think about in that regard is the Western Goals Computer Bank, which there's a computer operation for Western Goals in Germany, and of course the thing that I was referring to before the break, the Los Angeles Police Department's formerly their Police Disorder Intelligence Division, the PDID, now their Anti-Terrorist Division, had been working notably with a fellow named Jay Paul and also Mr. Scheidecker, had been working very closely with Western Goals. And Western Goals is an extremely reactionary organization headed up by the late Larry McDonald formerly, and involving a number of different people, some Third Reich veterans, some Gestapo people. General Singlaub, I believe, is a member of Western Goals. I know that Roger Milliken, a director of W.R. Grace and a member of the Knights of Malta, is. It's a very far right-wing organization, and certainly those are two data banks to think about. You know, again, as far as correlating and accessing computers, I'm not really, you know, those are two of the main organizations to think about. That huge computer operation down in down in Austin, rather, which is also the same place where the University of Texas is, and I know U of T has a huge computer huge computer education program going, which is also receiving funding. Those are two to think about as far as actually how to access them, or, you know, the technical links. I don't know much about it because, you know, in a hardware and a software sense, I'm a computer ignoramus, which is unusual in this valley. But those are a couple things to think about in that regard.
Yeah, I don't know much about it either, but it appears that the data and characterizing people by the statistics of the things they do and the associations they keep sounds like a pretty scary, downright scary thing, and seems to be a direct descendant of transplant of intelligence organizations.
Well, we have talked in an earlier broadcast. We read an article by Jack Anderson stating that there are certain elements that are allied with the Reagan administration that literally want to start putting people down in childhood and computers as possible anti-socials. You know, I mean, and then when you start talking about that kind of stuff, indeed, caller, you're talking weird. You know, you're talking danger.
Yeah, that's very closely affiliated with the Nazi racial theory, in which the so-called criminal biological types were a major focus not only of study but also of classification and communication. A name to think about in that connection as well is the organization Interpol, now called the International Criminal Police Organization, formerly the International Criminal Police Commission. Long-standing affiliations with Third Reich through Otto Steinhausel, Nazi police chief of Austria, and Reinhard Heydrich, who we talked about. His connections with J. Edgar Hoover and Hoover's affiliations with Trifa. J. Edgar Hoover was actually appointed by Herbert Hoover, if you want to trace those links going all the way back to, if you heard the first Radio Free America broadcast, the immediate period of anti-Soviet reaction, and the Interpol was created in 1923 as a private corporation. It's not a public organization, although through the National Central Bureau, each affiliate country's head office of Interpol, it links the police of 100 different nations. And as late as 1973, there was a fellow named Paul Diekop, a former Sicherheitsdienstman, a Gehlen agent, a former SS intelligence man, who was he was president of Interpol, and I think his secretary general at that point was a guy named Jean Nepot, who was a Vichy French police official. So the links there are very wide, and Interpol was tracking, you know, radicals and criminals of all kinds. It does some legitimate police work. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not totally classifying that organization as a monolith. It's important to realize there are divisions, but Interpol had strong inclinations in that regard, and during World War II, when one of the provisions of Interpol due to early infighting was that the head of the Austrian Federal Police would be president, and during World War II and prior to it, when it was under Nazi domination, Interpol's their magazine did talk about various criminal biological types, and classifying criminals by Jewish race and so forth. Again, we talked about that in the second Radio Free America broadcast.
Oh, well, that sounds like a difficult assignment to research down the connections between the personnel doing all that work. So I'll just have to thank you for working on that yourselves, and maybe jump a little farther and see if there's any coherent advice for avoiding that kind of action nowadays. Is it to become a businessman, to go into small business so you contribute to the economy and therefore are less likely to be discriminated against by the people that are
Well, that's an individual solution. As far as a societal solution, I think that what we're speaking toward is that people getting angry in a controlled way and becoming politically active in an intelligent way and doing their best with whatever resources they have to inform other people in the most calm, persuasive manner so that those people will know, and beginning to use that kind of focus in all political decision-making.
If you think, caller, that becoming a small businessman is a good way of escaping nuclear war, go for it.
Right. Exactly. Those red and white striped awnings will cover a multitude of sins, but they ain't much good against fallout.
Yeah, that's a good point. A point well taken.
Okay. Anything else, caller?
I guess that's what cassette tapes are good for. I'll just have to keep passing them around, and thank you for such a good product.
Yeah, well, we thank you for passing them around. Thanks again.
All right, on. Bye.
Good night. Okay, we got a couple lines open, 415-941-2500. Good evening, Campbell. Welcome to KFJC and Radio Free America.
Well, nice to be here. I've been listening to you guys for a while. I called after the Uncle Sam and the Swastika program, and I was the caller who mentioned being a member of a company that's owned by the Grace Corporation.
Oh, right. I do remember that.
Oh, okay. Well, we've had another visit from a Grace executive, and he's not any of the ones that had visited before. He had visited, but he wasn't one of the ones I had talked about. And I just have to say that, as you guys so often mention in the broadcast, that you don't want to characterize any group or organization by certain individuals or members or even people controlling that organization. I have to say in all fairness that I've been recording these tapes, and some of the management of my company knew that I had this information and went out to dinner with him and actually brought some of it up.
They brought it up to you, like to talk about it, you mean?
Well, no, they brought it up to him.
Oh, brought it up to him?
Yes, a Grace executive.
Well, how very interesting. What was his response?
His response was that he knows Otto Ambrose, or knows of him, and he dislikes him quite a bit.
No, one thing I'm curious about, caller. How did you tell the people that you'd been taping this stuff? I mean, was it you brought it up to him yourself?
Sure, I brought it up. It's a tight-knit company, and I brought it up that I've been taping, and this stuff was all very interesting. And of course, I think you'll see I'm pretty innocent as far as having any real firm convictions, other than I observe, bewildered from afar, listening to you guys since last November. And so I was just bringing this stuff up, and everybody in our company is pretty good-natured. We don't mind being owned by W.R. Grace. And so they just brought it up with this guy in conversation. And in all truthfulness, he said that he pretty much disliked all the nasty historical things that happened also.
That's a point. Let me expound on that very briefly. It's a good point to make. And again, you don't ever automatically equate a person with the functioning of an organization as an institution. If you meet someone who worked for the CIA, you don't say, you fascist or you baby killer, this thing. It's a point we made in connection with the Green Berets. I've known a couple of fellows who were Green Berets and they got along with very well. I knew a guy who was a Special Forces intelligence officer whose uncle owned Hughes Aircraft, and he was a great guy. We had a great time, one time, hoisting a couple of tall cool ones and kicking stuff around. I was one of the relatively few people he could sort of let his hair down with, and who would know what he was talking about. It was really good. You don't automatically equate an individual with any kind of an organization. All right, give you an idea, up here at KFJC, we had a written offer from a former local coordinator for the John Birch Society, of which Larry McDonald was the head, to participate in the Guns of November. There's a fellow who belongs to the John Birch Society with whom I share research. I don't take truck with the organization as a whole, which I have no use for, but this guy seems to me a straight shooter, and he gives me great information, helps get me books that I don't have, and I give him some of my duplicates, and he's a frequent participator here on One Step Beyond and these other shows, or on Radio Free America, One Step Beyond, and the other call-in shows, and has routinely contributed great information. You wouldn't necessarily know. I mean, there are a few things that he's said from time to time that might clue you into the fact that he's affiliated with the Birch Society, but not in a doctrinaire sense, and he's a really good fellow. Now, you don't say, oh, you're affiliated with the John Birch Society, well, you must be a fascist, I'm not going to talk to you. But it's just, you never equate an individual with an organization. That's why, the point we made was that a lot of American intelligence officers from various of the agencies came across some of these CIA ODESSA connections and reported them to their superiors, and eventually they were squelched. Same thing with Britain. If you're gonna automatically equate a person with an organization, you're gonna make a mistake, which was made a lot during the Vietnam War, in which returning veterans were called baby killers and so forth, and they were alienated, and a lot of them, on top of the scars of combat and so forth, bear the psychological scars of that to this day. So, I think I'm glad you brought that up, and I think it's a point, perhaps I run on a little too long, but I think it's a point that should be reinforced. You don't automatically assume that the person's cool either, but, secrecy is the stuff of fascism, and that's why we encourage people to talk about this stuff, get the information out,
Sure, and I think it's important, too, for just the overall, objectivity and consciousness of all the listeners, and I think it supports your points quite well, to understand that maybe you and most of your listeners are objective people and are not fanatic leftists or fanatic, conspirator theorists. And rather, they're just logical thinking people, and they understand that there's a myriad of things that can come together. And a lot of these connections are maybe a chance or somehow a common denominator among things that different groups want, but aren't necessarily some giant master plan, but that one group hooks up with something they have in common with another group, and here we go,
Yeah, unfortunately, of the people who believe in simple answers to complex problems, we don't hang out with many of them. One of them happens to be president, which is a little nerve-wracking.
Yeah.
One thing along what you said, caller, well, we actually do have people from both the doctrinaire left and the doctrinaire right who listen to this broadcast regularly, because I'm just judging from the communications we get from time to time, and that, to me, there's nothing about this whole effort that I take more pride in than that fact. Maybe we're one of the very few things those two could agree about, and of course most of the people, as you said, fall somewhere in between there, and are just trying to take that stuff up. That's why I blew my stack at this fellow, our caller, who calls himself the Gadfly.
Right, I remember that. That was pretty entertaining.
Well, the point is, he said, basically, since you don't seem to trust Western sources, I'm going to read you from Stalin, which, as far as I was concerned, I'm not going to go on about a great life. We use nothing but Western sources here, and I just, I lost my temper because I considered it, basically I thought it was just a shallow attempt at tossing red paint on us. And,
what he means is that we don't take William Colby at his word, so that's not trusting Western sources, right?
Well, the point is that, when you examine, you have to check Anthony Sutton for his sources, because he is capricious in his use of those. That was the point I was making, and I could have indicted Sutton for his endorsement of, I can't remember the fellow's name, Gary Allen, who Sutton relies on, but Gary Allen wasn't brought up for discussion. The material from All Honorable Men, it was something that the listeners were familiar with, but that's the point. It's not that we reject that caller's I obviously disagree with his views, but, it's not that we reject, differing viewpoints. On the other hand, if somebody's going to play dirty pool or deal from the bottom of the deck, we're going to call them on it. But, we're pretty straight shooters here, I think.
We're talking a vast metaphor salad up here tonight, Dave.
Yeah.
I hope you'll listen to that on the tape. That's amazing. We just strung about 700 of them together.
Well, I guess that in this final synthesis, there's just no substitute for good, hard work. And whether that's at your workplace or whether that's researching, it pays to do your homework and try to be authentic in describing and observing what's around you.
Arbeit macht frei.
Yeah, to make one last little point on that, as you said, at your workplace doing research, and this is something I feel very strongly about, there is no cure, there is no substitute for a little hard work in making decisions. And I think that that's where a lot of this stuff slides right past most people. Politics, business as usual, people don't want to work at thinking about things before making decisions, like what they're going to vote for.